Hello, this is the Stories Beside channel. I release videos every day for you. Subscribe and click the bell. Almost all the villagers were related to each other, not by blood, but by kinship. Such people as his wife's cousin were considered the inner circle here. They were invited to all the festivities from weddings to New Year's Eve, helped them with the household chores, brought freshly baked pierogi, and shared news. The far circle didn't seem to exist at all. And where was it to come from, if there were only 3 main surnames for the whole village, and only a few dozen people who did not belong to them? Village. They were used to it. And so the news that Stephen and Thompson were going to be sent to an orphanage because he had no relatives, at first stirred and surprised the village. Then, of course, they remembered. Thompson came to the village a little over 10 years ago to live and work. Young, cheerful, in love with each other, friendly, polite, and hardworking, they surprisingly easily fit into the atmosphere of the village, accepted the rules that reigned here, and became their own. It happens that even after 50 years, one of the newcomers is perceived as a stranger. But the couple and Thompson were considered locals after 2 years, and were surprised when it turned out that they did not know about some important events of 5 years ago. The young couple lived amicably both among themselves and with their neighbors. Little by little, they organized the household, put in order the old hut, allocated to them by the collective farm. He worked as a veterinarian. She worked as a teacher. Soon they gave birth to a son, Stephen, with whom all the old ladies of the neighborhood willingly married. There were no grandmothers in the family for some reason. Thompson himself said that he was an orphanage, and his wife never mentioned her parents, and she carefully avoided questions on the subject. Then it was decided that both spouses were from the orphanage, but the teacher Thompson, for some reason, shy to talk about it, or simply does not like to remember. But they stopped asking questions. If a man doesn't want to tell, there's no need to pull this soul out of him. And how it really was, the village learned only years later, after the veterinarian and his wife were killed by a car and their son, 10-year-old Stephen, was left an orphan. The couple were buried by the whole village. The organization of the mournful event was undertaken by the head of the village council, his neighbors on the street, and the same neighbors helped him. In the first few days, he groomed the green. They fed him, took him to their homes for the night, or stayed with him in the empty houses, sent him to school, checked his lessons, at the same time watched over the household, which was left from the spouses. A 10-year-old boy could not manage with pigs and a cow. They did not think much about the boy's fate. They habitually thought that someone from the family would appear and take custody of him. But instead of relatives, there was a local district police officer, asked the neighbor to take care of him at that moment in the hut and help with finding some documents. He explained that he was preparing papers to send Stephen to an orphanage. I wanted to talk to Stephen himself about it. Yeah. The neighbor said no. Don't let the boy make a fuss, she said. He'd better look through his own channels. Maybe he's got some relatives left in this world. Rick, of course, was in an orphanage. And maybe he has brothers, sisters, relatives somewhere. And we don't know anything about Miranda. Maybe she's an orphan, maybe not. What if she has one, or a grandmother, or even a niece? Look for her and be a friend. And if you don't find any, ask our people. Maybe someone will take Stephen into their family, get custody. He's not a stranger to us. After all, he's ours, he's his own, and you can always put him in an orphanage. It didn't take long to persuade the district police officer. Being in the 5th generation, one could say indigenous, he was accustomed to perceive his fellow villagers as one big family. He regarded Stephen as something like a 5th nephew, and was not at all eager to hand him over to the care of the state. It was up to his superiors to demand it. But having served 20 years in the police, he had already learned to let some of the requests of his superiors go on the brakes, if the matter was worth it. And now, having stipulated the sudden difficulty in finding Thompson's documents, the village policeman conducted his own little investigation. Thompson had indeed been brought up in an orphanage, where his own mother had surrendered him immediately after his birth. Traces of his parent had been lost, and it was impossible to find her. And there was no point in looking for her. If the woman refused her own son, she would hardly be interested in her grandson. But Miranda's parents were easy to find. It was only necessary to submit a request for her maiden name Turner in the city from where the couple came to the village. Not only parents, but 2 older siblings with husbands and families, and a maternal grandmother, Evelyn. Finding such a crowd of close relatives for Stephen, the precinct officer was encouraged. One of them would surely take the boy in, he thought. But after a few calls around town, his hopes were dashed. At Miranda's parents' apartment, his mother answered the phone. She took the news about the tragic death of her youngest daughter rather coolly, but politely thanked for the information. But Kolka laughed wryly at the offer to take her grandson to her. "Do you think I need this trick?" she asked, confused. And what else was missing? "I'm not in the habit of bringing dirt into the house." Stunned by this reaction, the village policeman tried to contact Miranda and Thompson. But even here he was met with failure. One of the women sighed sincerely about her sister's death, but she refused to take the tape, saying she had no time to raise a child. "My husband and I are geologists," she explained sadly. "We are always on expeditions, traveling. We are at home only 2 months a year. We can't have a child of our own with this rhythm of life. How can we take responsibility for someone else's child who has been through such a trauma?" The second sister was more abrupt. "Even the root Miranda child is Miranda on the problems," she said. "She has never helped me with my difficulties. So why should I behave any differently?" "But Miranda is dead," cautiously reminded the interlocutor of the militiaman. "She can't solve her own problems if she wants to. You should have thought of that earlier, when you were going to have a baby with no one, without family support." The woman cut off and hung up. The policeman, dumbfounded, shook his head and dialed the number of the parents' apartment again. This time, the phone was picked up by the father of the family. To the surprise of the policeman, he completely repeated the reaction of his wife. Coldly thanked for information about the fate of his youngest daughter, and dismissively, even somewhat insulted, refused to participate in the fate of her son. What to do next, the district police officer did not know. The behavior of Miranda's relatives did not fit into his picture of the world, and that prevented him from thinking and making normal decisions. But he understood one thing for sure: to suggest to his fellow villagers that Stephen be adopted or that he be given guardianship in such a situation was impossible. The boy had blood relatives, and they would certainly surface when someone started to register him in their family. Stephen will want to meet them, and the refusal will finally throw the boy out of favor. But they'll be talking about this family's behavior for years to come. And how will that talk affect Stephen? It's hard to predict. But to put the boy in an orphanage with living titles and divisions of great-grandparents is wrong, ridiculous, cruel. In the end, the man puzzled for several hours over what he should do in this situation, how to do better for the boy, whom he himself used to consider a distant relative. His thoughts were interrupted by a phone call. "Hello," said in the receiver a harsh old voice. "Did you call the apartment? My name is Evelyn. I want to know where my great-grandson Stephen Thompson is, and how can I meet him?" 2 days later, Stephen Evelyn's great-grandmother arrived in the village with a huge suitcase. From her, the policemen and the rest of the villagers gradually learned the story of the young teacher's family. Turner, Miranda's parents, were a well-to-do, educated, and even well-to-do family. But one day Miranda, Father Curiosity, for the sake of curiosity, thought to compile his genealogical tree, and in the process of researching archives, found out that one of his great-grandmothers, unknown how many times, came from a noble family. Roth was united, and besides not too noble. His eldest daughter, in order to improve the family fortune and give the younger sisters and brothers to arrange their lives, was given in marriage to a rich merchant, and her children, accordingly, passed into the merchant class. But this did not embarrass the young explorer. He fancied himself a bearer of noble blood and began to change his life accordingly. Worse, he infected his idea's spouse daughter, Evelyn. The mother, however, Miranda, as well as her older sisters, at that time was not even in the project. The newly minted nobleman introduced into life aristocratic habits in the form in which he understood them. For example, he got himself a terry robe, in which he went out to breakfast in the morning, began to call his mother-in-law maman in the French manner. He stopped communicating with several good friends because he considered their origin not noble enough. And of course, he dreamed of a son and heir to the family. But alas, a son never wanted to appear. With the first child, the man let the matter drop. For the second, he and his wife carefully calculated the date of conception on some tables found in the newspaper, but they must have miscalculated somewhere. Once again, a daughter was born. Daughters Turner, of course, picked up classical names and brought them up in accordance with the noble tradition, which he learned from classic novels. The girls from a young age had a governess, teaching them the rules of etiquette, needlework, and French. All of them attended art and music schools and ballroom dancing, and for each of them in advance was selected a groom from familiar families whose family tree suited their father. For the birth of the third child, Turner prepared thoroughly. He consulted with several doctors, read a lot of scientific and pseudoscientific articles on planning the sex of the future baby. He sat for several months on some smart diet, performed daily gymnastics and breathing exercises, made up a schedule of sex with his wife to accumulate male seed in the body and drain the female seed, as advised by one of the theories he had studied. His wife also adhered to a certain diet, once a week performed some rituals, decorated the bedroom in blue colors to attract male energy. In short, the preparation was on all fronts. The stronger was the disappointment when their third daughter was born. The couple even wanted to leave her in the maternity hospital, but Evelyn managed to dissuade the new parents from this idea. At least somewhere this nonsense with nobility came in handy, recalled the old woman's son-in-law, told him that leaving a native child to fate is unworthy of a true aristocrat. Icons. He thought about it. Otherwise, goodness wouldn't convince. The girl was named Miranda and tried to bring up in the same traditions as her older sisters. But these attempts were not successful. The little girl from early childhood had a combative and Zedorknoi character, grew her free-spirited and stubborn. Apparently, Turner's efforts to give birth to a boy did not go completely in vain. Anechka's temperament was truly boyish. No, she did not grow up under a female. She was just an ordinary, active, and inquisitive child who learns the world with interest. Even as a toddler on walks, Miranda was unwilling to stroll gracefully by the hand with her governess through the yard or the square. She with a joyful squeal ran along the paths, crawled on her knees on the lawn, looking at some strange bugs, enthusiastically picking in the sandbox or climbing low trees. Slightly grown up, the girl resolutely sabotaged art school. In music school, transferred without asking parents from the piano class to the guitar class, and instead of ballroom dancing enrolled in the tourism section. From childhood, Miranda did only what she wanted to do. And no punishments from her father, no sermons from her mother that some activities and habits of behavior are unworthy of a well-behaved girl from a good family could not change that. Already disliked the youngest daughter for being born a girl, and her free-spirited nature only served to alienate Miranda from the family. Worst of all was the girl's blatant disregard for the aristocratic origins of her family. Miranda sincerely and openly laughed at her father when he started talking about his nobility and ancestry. She believed that in the 20th century, the century of scientific and technological progress, so boast of pedigree can only sweet retrograde. And to build a way of life equal to the ancestors of aristocrats would be crazy. Miranda more than once told her father about it, then provoked disputes that quickly turned into scandals. Of the whole family supported the girl only her grandmother. Her mother shared her father's ideas. The sisters, it seems, did not even occur to them that parents could be crossed or act in their own way, and Miranda lived the life she wanted. Her mother threw away her camping equipment. The girl took it out of trash cans and took it to her friends for safekeeping, and her father restricted her pocket money. Miranda found part-time jobs, turned in recyclable materials, embroidered various trifles, and sold them to a classmate. The girl was put under house arrest. She discouraged her grandmother to bring her more contemporary fiction from the library and immersed herself in reading. At the same time, Miranda studied well, engaged in social activities, and at school she was consistently praised. By the time she was 15 years old, her parents had not exactly resigned themselves to their daughter's character, but rather tolerated it as a necessary evil. Turner hoped that marriage will be able to tame the violent Miranda temper. Naturally, the groom for her, as well as for the two older daughters, was already provided. And the fact that this groom was 20 years older than the girl, neither father nor mother was not embarrassed at all. The main thing, he was from a kind of twisted noble family, and therefore suitable for their daughter. The marriage was planned after graduation. A noble maiden should have a higher education in some female specialty, thought Turner Sr., not technical by any means. That's a man's specialty. Something light, humanitarian, more for general development than for usefulness and earnings. And earnings. Aristocratic girls don't need to think. They'll be fully provided for by their husbands. That was Miranda's father's reasoning. Therefore, the older sister of the girl for the third year rotten at the Faculty of Art, and on weekends visited theaters and museums in the company, approved by the parents of the groom. The middle sister was interested in geology and minerals, but her father had already prepared a place for her at the library faculty. Miranda's future specialty was still only planned. The girl was finishing the 8th grade, but Miranda realized that in general terms her life would be no different from her sister's, and this did not suit her at all. After graduation, she told her parents that she was going on another trip with the tourist section and disappeared from home for a few days. And then she called and reported, stunned at her father, that she took her documents from school and entered a teacher training college in a neighboring city. "It seems to me, Dad," said the girl in the tube, "that teaching is quite a suitable occupation for the youngest daughter of a noble family." Remember the classics. In the 19th century, girls from noble families often went into teaching. So I'm not breaking the family tradition at all. Miranda tried not to sound too snide. I think it's high time for me to start my own life. At my age, noble women were already getting married, and some of them had their first children. But I'm still sitting on your mother's neck. So I've decided it's time to make my own way. There's a hostel here. They gave me a room, but it's not until August, but I've arranged to move in now. It's a small stipend, but it's enough. So I'm starting my adult life, but it's zero. My badge is running out. We're about to be separated. I'll write to you and my mom, send you my address. The girl finished quickly and hung up the phone without waiting for her father's reply. It was a blow below the belt for Tomichi. The mother drank heart drops, and the father was furious, pacing the room and clenching his fists. The sisters locked themselves in their rooms, not risking to be seen by their parents. Evelyn was able to calm the adults and convince them to accept her daughter's decision. But she would enter the institute later. "It's nothing," the grandmother exhorted. "Especially after college, you can go straight to the 3rd year, so even save time. We'll see how to live independently, assess how much calmer it was under the parental wing, and return home. You'll see." "But the dormitory," Mother exclaimed. "What kind of place is that for a young girl? A life of debauchery. And what if she gets pregnant?" "That unreasonable girl," objected Evelyn gently. "She would not risk her future so much." "It seems to me, Mother, that you were involved in her escape," Turner said suspiciously. "Probably sponsored it too." Of course, Evelyn was involved. She had never shared her daughters and son-in-law's approach to child-rearing and their desire to arrange the girls' lives without regard for their own wishes. And she had always adored Miranda because she saw that she could resist her father's will. But her son-in-law, of course, the old woman did not admit it. Then the peace was restored, and for the middle Miranda and sister this situation even benefited. Her parents allowed her to choose her future specialty independently, fearing that she too could jump out and run away from home. That decision was not approved, but they kept in touch with her, congratulated her on vacations, welcomed her home on vacation, and even occasionally helped her financially. But the shaky world collapsed when, just before graduation from college, the girl announced that she was marrying a good guy and leaving with him on assignment. And when she mentioned that the guy in the orphanage and her father finally lost his temper and told Miranda that she was no longer his daughter. From then on, Miranda was never mentioned in the house. She wrote to her parents a couple of times, but they tore up the envelopes without even opening them. So Evelyn did not manage to find out her granddaughter's new address in the educational section of the pedagogical school. They refused to give the elderly woman any information about the allocation. For some reason, Miranda stopped calling her father's house, so her traces were lost. Of course, you could go to the police. You could look for Miranda's classmates and find out from them something about the fiancé and the girl's new address. But Turner, sincerely offended by their daughter's behavior and the fact that she ruined their plans, were not going to do it. And Evelyn did not have the strength to actively search for her. With age, her health began to fail. Evelyn complained of vascular pain, heart, dizziness, and worries about her granddaughter only aggravated her condition. Nevertheless, when an elderly woman accidentally overheard a telephone conversation of her son-in-law and learned how the fate of her granddaughter and what future threatens her grandson, she, without a second's hesitation, packed up and came to the village. It's not a good idea to put the boy in an orphanage with living relatives, she explained to the district police officer. My daughter and my son-in-law have completely lost their nobility. They consider the boy almost a freak. But I'm still in my mind, and I'm not going to die. I'm sure I'll have enough Stephen until I'm 20. So give me a residence permit, comrade policeman. And tell me, what papers do I need to keep Stephen with me? Stephen was wary of Evelyn at first. The policeman brought her to the house in Thompson without warning immediately on the day of her arrival. He sat down opposite the boy and said, "Seriously, Stephen, here's the thing. According to the laws of our country, children under the age of 18 cannot live alone or with adults or in an orphanage. Since you don't have parents now, the law tells me to put you in an orphanage. But there's a relative of yours, your mom's grandmother. She can take custody of you, and then you can stay at home here. I understand the person. She's new to you, a stranger. But it's better to be with a new person in your home than with strangers and in a new place. Anyway, you guys stay here for a couple days, socialize, and I'll come back the day after tomorrow. Let me know. Do you want to live with your great-grandmother or do you want to leave? Whatever you decide, that's how it'll be." Stephen nodded demurely. The policeman shook his hand and left. The old woman and the boy were left alone. For a while they looked at each other in silence. Then Evelyn spoke. "My name is Evelyn," she said. "You can call me Evelyn if you like." And then she inquired in a businesslike manner, "Are you hungry?" "Not really, I guess," Stephen said uncertainly. He had expected a serious conversation about the rest of his life, but not about the hassle. About food. "When did you eat the last time?" Grandma kept up. "At lunchtime at school." After some thought, the boy answered, "That's 12 o'clock." So Stephen nodded. "And now it's already 6 o'clock in the evening." "That's not the point. Come on, Stephen, let's get you something for dinner. You team tell me where you keep what, how to use it, what utensils you can use, what you can't use for the host in general. I'll do the cooking." Stephen. It was flattering that Evelyn recognized him as master and promised to obey him. He feared that the strange old woman would immediately set her own rules in the house, which, of course, would be different from the rules adopted by his parents. And then the whole household would be destroyed. The remnants of his familiar, quiet, happy life would be lost forever, and it would become finally clear that his father and mother had gone away for good and would never return. From the day of the funeral, Stephen had decided to behave as if his mother and father had gone away on a long business trip and left him to look after the house and the household. Such an attitude helped him not to write the news that he might be taken away to an orphanage. Scared the boy. But then he thought, if the sudden great-grandmother will start to run the house in her own way and destroy everything that was created by his parents, then maybe the orphanage is not such a bad thing. He will not be able to resist her. But to live next to her and watch the familiar world being destroyed piece by piece every day, he won't be able to either. Of course, Stephen didn't think exactly like that. For a 10-year-old boy, such reasoning is still a bit difficult, but that's how he felt, and that's why he watched Evelyn's actions cautiously. The old woman, however, behaved carefully. She did obey all of her grandson's instructions, and in the process of cooking managed to get him talking. Stephen started with the smallest things: which pan should be used to fry potatoes, which knife to use to cut bread, and which knife to use to cut meat, on which shelf of the refrigerator to store a can of milk. But soon the boy was already talking excitedly about how they lived with his father and mother, what they were into, how they spent their time, and how they socialized. Evelyn listened, asked questions, where she sympathized, where she laughed, and where she told her story of Miranda Stephen's childhood to her mother, not forgetting to mention how she and the boy were similar in character. During the conversation, they finished dinner, drank tea, moved into the room to the sofa, where Stephen eventually fell asleep, resting his head on his great-grandmother's lap. And when he woke up in the middle of the night, he found her sitting over him, stroking his head and whispering something like, "Bayou, what are you doing?" Surprised the boy. "Lie down. It's nighttime." "Yes, that's something," thought Stephen, answered the old woman, embarrassed. "So good you fell asleep. It was a pity to wake you up, to disturb you. And where to go for treatment, I don't know." Come on," Stephen said sternly. "At night you should sleep lying in bed, not sitting up, to rest your body and gain strength," he said in an instructive tone, obviously imitating one of the adults. "Come on, I'll show you to your room." Stephen took Evelyn to the room, which was considered a guest room in the house. He helped her unmake the bed. After some thought, he brought a second blanket. "It's getting chilly at night," he explained businesslike. "Thank you. You're a thoughtful guy." Evelyn smiled. "I can't help it," Stephen said judiciously. "Since it's just the two of us, we'll take care of each other." He said it, and he was surprised at himself. He had not known Evelyn for 24 hours before, but now, after the long conversation, after the sincere interest and respect of this strange old woman for his family and his world, after the way she had carefully and touchingly taken care of his sleep, this Evelyn felt more dear to him than anyone else in the world, and he agreed to live with her and take care of her. As a grandson of a grandmother or a great-grandmother should be cared for, it didn't matter. That's what Stephen reported to the police station 2 days later. And not once after all the years of living with Evelyn did not regret this decision. The village discussed Miranda's story for a long time. It did not fit into the worldview of the locals. But Evelyn was quickly accepted and considered her own. In Callanan's opinion, she had done the right and logical thing. You have a family, so take care of it. Helping your children and grandchildren, no matter what mistakes they made, no matter how stupid you think they are. I don't like to be persuaded and educated like that. You can give us children, but don't leave them to their fate and don't break their character. That's the way they reasoned in the village. Of course, this did not mean that in every Callanan yard reigned peace of prosperity. After all, this is not a fairy tale village, but a real one. There were quarrels, scandals, and fights. And even in flogging a child or dragging him by the ears for disobedience was not seen as anything special. But every villager knew that if anything happened, the whole family would help and support him. That is, half of the village. And what else does a man need if not the assurance of a strong rear and the existence of a place where he will always be accepted and supported? Not much, really. Stephen Thompson grew up a quiet and sensible lad. He was respected in the village, and often even grown men turned to him for advice and help. Accustomed from childhood to consider himself the master of the house and to take care of Evelyn, the boy gradually learned everything that was required for life in the village and acquired a calm, confident, and slightly patronizing manner, which extended to everyone with whom he interacted. The one thing the lad flatly refused to deal with was automobiles. He did not want not to learn to drive, not to understand their structure, underlyingly considering auto technicians his sworn enemy. After all, it was because of her that he once lost his parents. For a long time, he refused to drive cars, and only at the age of 14 he began to sit quietly in the passenger seat. But this punctiliousness and fellow villagers forgave him, considering it more of a harmless oddity than a consequence of a serious childhood trauma. Did not like his life, like the village where he grew up from childhood, and the house left by his parents. He sincerely loved his grandmother and worried about her. And so his plans for life after graduation were simple and ingenuous: to go to work in the village collective farm, and to continue to take care of the Tom and his piece of land to the best of his ability. However, Evelyn was not satisfied with these plans. Already after the 9th grade, she began to persuade her great-grandson to go to the city and enroll there in a school for workers without a specialty. In the collective farm, at least shovel, she said, because no one really appreciates them, and they are paid pennies. A specialist with a profession is a different story, and you'll have a better place, a more serious attitude, and a higher salary. You and I don't need a lot of money now. But when you get married and have a family and kids, your expenses will increase. I don't plan to get married yet. Stephen waved it off. And cute, laughed Evelyn. It's such a thing, it can't be predicted. Today you do not plan, but tomorrow you plan. So what? The boy jokingly interrogated. And that you have to be prepared for it in advance. Great-grandmother was getting angry. And anyway, what if life turns out to be different if you leave the village? It will be easier to find a job in a new place if you have a profession on your hands. Go study. The Kolkos won't get rid of you. Evelyn had these conversations regularly. And finally, she managed to convince Stephen. True, the boy with his usual thoroughness first consulted with some of his fellow villagers, whose opinion he especially valued, and then asked the chairman of the collective farm about what specialties were in short supply. And at the end of the day, he made a deal with his neighbors and secured their promises to look after Evelyn during the week while he was at school. Only then Stephen Thompson went to town and applied for a welding apprenticeship. Evelyn approved of the specialty. A good trade, she said. Versatile. Not only in the village you can find a place, but also in the city if life demands. And you'll never be out of work, about having to look for a place in the city or in some other village than the village. Stephen refused to even think about it then. 5 days a week he lived in the dormitory at the vocational school. In the mornings he went to classes. In the evenings he worked part-time as a janitor at the kindergarten nearby. You can't eat on a stipend alone. On Friday evening, the guy ran to the station to catch the last bus to the village, to help his great-grandmother with household chores, to please her with hotels, to bring the ordered medicines, and just to be at home. Back to the city, he would return on Monday on the first morning bus to be in time for classes. That's how the first year went for school, and the second year everything changed. At the beginning of September, the boy came to the library of the college for a set of textbooks. There, as always on such days, there was noise and crowding. Having made his way to the counter, Stephen showed the librarian his student card. What group? Older. That's the third window over there. That's where we have the intern working today. Dickhead. So get ready, you won't be out of here for another hour. Thompson went to the third window and saw a young girl with a confused face behind it. Soared at the risk of Rosneft. She was trying to collect sets of textbooks for 3 different specialties at the same time, give out the collected textbooks, answer questions, and maintain silence and order in the queue. Naturally, she was doing just about nothing. So the girl was clearly on the verge of hysterics. Stephen looked at her, and in his head Evelyn's voice sounded audibly. Marriage, my dear. It's a thing that can't be predicted. One day you don't plan to marry, and the next day you do. The boy waved his head as if to ward off an obsession, and then suddenly, unexpectedly for himself, He swung sharply across the bar separating the hall and landed right under the feet of the unfortunate intern. "Hello," he said, rising. "I, Stephen, and what's your name?" "Lisa." "Stunned," said the girl. "How are you?" "You can't come in here." "Lisa, nice to meet you." Stephen paid no attention to her attempts at indignation. "Lisa, let me help you. I see our troubles are weighing on your mind right now. I suggest we divide up the duties. You collect the kits on the list, and I'll issue them. I know how to fill out the forms, don't worry. Are you lost in your racks? It's coming." Before the girl nodded confusedly, Thompson had already settled down at the issuing window, lined up a column behind a barrier of ATT workers, and strictly told them not to make any noise. "Who will break the silence and order will get the books with the very last," sternly informed the guy. "Lisa, where do you have ready sets?" "That's good. Your student card." He turned to the first one standing behind the barrier. The work boiled over. The girl tried to watch her sudden assistant for a while, but then rushed to the storage room to get the missing textbooks. 3 hours later, the crowd in the library hall had dissipated. Only a few people remained. Stephen straightened his back, stretched sweetly, and smiled at Lisa. "Well, I helped you through the main influx of customers," he said with a smile. "Now only the latecomers will go, 2 people at a time. I'm sure you can handle them." "Thank you," mumbled the girl, embarrassed. "It's my first day here today. I did not even know that I would get to the distribution. Otherwise, I would have prepared the kits in advance. And so I don't orient myself to anyone. What books are entitled?" "I don't know. I'd be lost without you. How can I thank you?" "Marry me," Stephen said quite seriously. "But if you're not ready, we can take a walk after work. You finish at 5. So I'll meet you." Shell bowed, jumped over the barrier separating the librarian's workplace from the main hall, and walked out, not forgetting his stack of textbooks. The first walk was followed by a second, and then a third. Soon the visits of the young people became regular. Stephen almost stopped talking to his fellow students. There was no time left for that. He quit the kindergarten, freeing up his evenings for meetings with Lisa, and began to work part-time at night unloading railroad cars. Tired as hell. He went from honor students to 6th graders, but he still wouldn't let himself get any C's. Fortunately, sitting at the desks of the school was soon replaced by industrial practice at the factory. There it was easier to maintain vigor and activity. Yes, and to study his specialty, Stephen finally became really interesting. Only one thing in his life remained unchanged: time from Friday evening to Monday morning, the guy always spent in the village. Lisa didn't mind. She was touched by the young man's devotion to the only native woman in his life. The girl knew the history of Lincoln and his family and sympathized with the tragedy that the boy had suffered as a child. However, even if it had not been for that tragedy, Lisa would not have prevented Thompson's visits to the village. She herself had only her mother in her family. She had never seen her father. He was quite casual and hardly knew of her existence. The grandparents had died long before she was born. Her mother had no siblings, and her cousins and 3 siblings were scattered across the country and hardly ever got in touch. Lisa had a lifelong fear that her mother would one day be gone and she would be all alone. She saw echoes of this fear in Stephen, and so treated his regular absences to the countryside with understanding. Tearful mother. Thompson met at the end of September, and as something surprisingly quickly became friends with her. And on New Year's Eve, he took the women to the village to introduce them to Evelyn and celebrate the holiday. Evelyn approved of her great-grandson's choice. She is a good girl, serious, modest, responsible, not like our local ponytails. When almost at the New Year's table for the first time seriously talked about the wedding. Before that, Lisa, though she was in love with the battleship, had taken her suitor's words about marriage lightly. But having visited the village, having got acquainted with the woman, and having seen how Stephen behaves in his house on his plot, how he communicates with neighbors, how he takes care of his grandmother and her mother, the guest of his house suddenly realized that she could not find a better husband. With this guy, she will be like behind a stone wall. He would be safe and secure. And the fear of being alone one day can be forgotten forever. Only one thing troubled Lisa, her fiance's intention to return to the village after graduation. She had nothing against rural life, and she liked the village, and the prospect of living under the same roof with Evelyn did not promise any difficulties. But he, she said, was interfering strongly with the argument as to whether the wedding should be in May or whether she should listen to a common superstition and postpone it until June. Let's solve one important issue. You've always said that family is the most important thing for you, and that's why you want to live with your family, with your grandmother here in the village. But family's important to me too, and my family is my mom, and I can't leave her alone in the city and move somewhere else without her. I feel like it would be a betrayal, and I can't take her with me. She has a job there, friends, a familiar way of life. She's a city girl to the core. She won't fit in the country. That's why I want to tell you right away that we'll live with my mom or near my mom and no other way. I'm sorry. If you're happy with that, we can go back to discussing the wedding. Lisa lowered her eyes and blushed. The words were not easy for her to say, but she had thought that once she had spoken, she would be relieved. However, now the girl was gripped by fear. What if her lover now refuses to marry her? What will she do then? Why is he silent? Lord, but why does he keep silent? While Stephen was frantically thinking what to say to this speech, Evelyn took the floor. Well done, she said. Well done, girl. You can see you've grown up a good daughter, loving, responsible, and asked the question in time. That's right. Such things should be decided on the shore. If you want to know my opinion, the Bible says that a man shall be molded from his father and mother and shall be molded to his wife. You see, you chose your wife, so be with her at one and don't break her under yourself. But you should stick to her and follow her. That's if we consider the question from a moral point of view, and if it's practical. Of course, I'll be glad to have Stephen around. But if he goes to the city, I won't get there in a year or so. On the contrary, I'm used to coping on my own. And my neighbors are close by. If anything, always help. You'll come to visit for a weekend, once a month is good. And the rest. Don't worry about me, Stephen. Just worry about yourself. You really won't mind if I stay in town? Stephen asked, cautiously relieved. The wedding was set for May. The first day they celebrated in town with friends and Lisa and Emily's mother. The second day we went to the village, and there we had a feast for great-grandmother, neighbors, friends. In short, for almost half the village. The morning after the feast, Evelyn, having served breakfast, looked at the newlyweds with tenderness and said, Well, I've raised you. You're all grown up now. You have your own family. Soon the children will come. You won't be left alone. Now you won't be afraid to die. He and Lisa began to object to the great-grandmothers. It's too early to die. Who are we going to visit on weekends? Who will help with the children? Who will teach us everything? Evelyn listened to their objections, smiling as adults do when listening to children's babble, and shook her head slightly. She died a month after her great-grandson's wedding, June 1991. She waited for Stephen's next weekend visit, fed him dinner, listened to the latest news, kissed him goodnight, went to bed, and didn't wake up in the morning. Evelyn is 95 years old. The death of her great-grandmother shocked Thompson. Somehow Evelyn, despite her advanced age and numerous illnesses, seemed eternal to the lad. He had gotten used to the idea that she, who had once saved him from loneliness, who had become his support and encouragement, who had taught him everything, would always be there for him and with her forever. His parents' house, a piece of his childhood that he wanted so badly to keep. Stephen blamed himself for failing to take care of his grandmother properly, abandoned her, did not keep her safe with longing and acute pain in his soul. The boy thought about the necessity of pounding the house in which he and his grandmother lived and leaving it unattended. Of course, no one in the village will not climb into it and ruin it. It is understandable. But any villager knows that empty houses fall into disrepair very quickly. You can walk, look after, water the flowers on the windows, and sweep away the dust. In the summer, you can paint the lot, and in the winter, you can squeeze the furnace and throw snow off the roof. It doesn't help if there isn't a permanent resident in the house. It is as if he is aging. Then he gets in, starts to get sick, and slowly dies. You go into it after a few years and the walls are in place, and the furniture is the same, and the painting. On the walls hang familiar ones, but the air is heavy and dead, and the shadows in the corners are frowning, and everything seems alien and unfamiliar. And how much not to air such a house, how much not to clean it. Without adding light, this lifeless atmosphere cannot be driven out. Lagamko several times has been in such abandoned houses and did not want his parents' house to repeat their fate. However, Thompson could not suffer long for his great-grandmother, the end of his childhood, and his parents' house. August 1991, and all moral torment and mental problems were pushed to the background. They were overshadowed by the banal and completely unromantic need to survive. Stephen Thompson was returning home from a tour of duty. For more than 5 years, he had worked for a company that built oil storage tanks. He would go to some remote part of the country, most often to the north, and spend 3 months at a time. Then he returned home for a month, communicated with his relatives, brought his paycheck, did some household chores, and generally got back a little in body and soul from the endless frosts and the workplace. A month for this was not always enough, especially in terms of mental rest. Life away from his family was hard for Stephen, but there was no other way out. The shift paid well, and not badly, and in the city where he lived with his wife and mother-in-law. Even now, 7 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, they could not offer such salaries. And in the very early 90s, there were no salaries at all. Just promises. Stephen did not like to remember those times as hard and hopelessly bleak. There was always no money in the house. Food was very simple and scarce. And the need, for example, to fix broken shoes provoked a real financial crisis. He then turned around as best he could, grabbing any part-time jobs from welder to loader. He was good at almost everything. In the first year, he used the house in the village instead of a dacha, served the whole vegetable garden with potatoes, and in the fall sold it to neighbors and colleagues of his wife and mother-in-law. Well, and recorded for the winter for his own, of course. This endless race for every penny exhausted the guy, but it seemed to him at the time that he was coping. His women are clothed, not hungry, no debts. Even the rent is paid neatly and on time. It is only necessary to wait a little. When the situation in the country will stabilize, it will be easier to go through a difficult period. Of course, waiting for better times at his factory in Thompson, he was not going to. He was in constant search for a more profitable job. But when one of his buddies told him about the shift work, Stephen at first refused. It's not so bad that we have to leave our family for a few months, he thought at the time. A few days later, however, an event occurred that changed his point of view. He remembered that day well. Lisa, who had lately been sort of nervous and brooding at the same time, had returned from work very early. Pale, weak, and suddenly very tired. She mumbled, "I don't feel well. I'm going to lie down," and disappeared into her room. Stephen fussed. Then he offered water, food, tea, some medicine. He tried to ask her where it hurt. Lisa replied that she just needed to rest, and soon she did doze off. But when Stephen stopped by an hour later to see if everything was all right, he saw a blood stain spreading across his wife's light-colored pants. "Uterine bleeding," said someone in his head and voice. It got scary. He pushed his wife, but she was surprisingly calm. While Stephen rushed to call an ambulance, Lisa tidied herself and the bed. She changed her clothes, sat down next to her husband, and calmly said, "Don't worry, everything is fine. Really, it will go away tomorrow. And if it doesn't, why is it not on time at all? There's so much blood." Stephen was confused. Lisa, too, looked confused and bewildered, and a little frightened. "Stephen," after a moment's silence, she said at last, I didn't want you to know, but as it happens, I was pregnant and had an abortion today." The man remained silent, dumbfounded. Lisa continued cautiously. "You see, having a baby now is fucking impossible. It's just impossible. It would probably be impossible to bear it healthy. We have to survive from ruble to kopeck, from bread to potatoes. How will the fetus develop with such nutrition? What will we feed it when it is born? What to dress it in and what to raise it on? We're on a budget right now. But a child is a very big expense, and to raise him in poverty is just unfair." Agreed. "So I consulted my mom." "But why didn't you consult me?" asked Stephen. "Or do I have nothing to do with this child?" "Come on, Lisa," almost insulted. "Who is, if not you? Don't make it up. It's just women's business. It's not customary to discuss them with men." "Stephen, this decision was very hard for me, wasn't it? But now it's the only sensible way out of the situation. And we'll have a baby for sure, just a little later, in a few years. The doctor said that today's operation will not affect the possibility of conception in the future." She said something else, but Thompson wasn't listening. A crushing sense of guilt came over him. Once again, he had missed something. Failed to save his child's life. He had failed to see it through. He realized there was nothing Lisa could say against him. She's right about everything. Their family's really struggling to get by, to stay afloat. Having a baby is guaranteed to drag them down at their current income. But damn it, how could he have missed it? He focused only on the present moment, on making sure there was something to eat in the house every day, that there was no debt accumulating and all bills were paid on time, that there was some minimal emergency stash like buying a new jacket or shoes, and did not think at all about the future, about work for the future, and even that this future in the form of pregnancy can come so suddenly, too, did not think. And so he missed it, and he wanted a child so badly. Along with guilt came resentment toward Lisa. Why didn't she consult him? Did she think he was so worthless and useless by default, so incapable of providing for a full family, so useless that she doesn't even see fit to discuss his child's future with him? A greater blow to a man's ego could not be imagined. Lisa, as if she had read her husband's thoughts, spoke up. "I didn't want to burden you with this, Stephen," she said guiltily. "I see how much you do for us, how hard you work. You're working your ass off. You're doing the best you can in our situation, and even, it seems, more than you can. I understand how much effort you put into making sure we don't go hungry. But I realize nowadays only businessmen make money, and you and I aren't cut out for it. I didn't want to worry you too much." But Stephen wasn't listening again. All he could think about was that he had once again wronged his family. He had already allowed the death of his grandmother, and now he had failed to preserve his firstborn, to provide him with normal conditions for birth. Of course, any person looking at things objectively would say that Stephen is not to blame for these deaths. But how easy it is to reason objectively when you are outside the situation, not inside it. Stephen was firmly convinced of his responsibility for everything that had happened and immediately swore to himself that he would not make such mistakes again. The next day, he called an acquaintance who offered him a job as a shift worker, and a couple of weeks later, having passed all the interviews and medical examinations, he left on his first business trip. Since then, the family's life has gotten better little by little. The money Stephen brought back was enough not only for basic needs, but also for more serious things. They renovated the apartment, where the three of them continued to live. They renovated the furniture, changed their clothes, and bought some household appliances. Once a year, Stephen took his women to the sea. Favoring foreign resorts became available. Lisa went to work from the library of the school to a private gymnasium. The pay was better and more regular. The gymnasium was a bit far from home, and Stephen bought his wife a car to make it easier for her to get there. Of course, not a foreign car, but a simple copy of the domestic car industry. But it was still better. I'm always late. Broken and perpetually overcrowded public transportation. Stephen was terribly afraid for his wife, ever since the accident that killed his parents. The man had never learned to trust cars. But Lisa drove carefully and with great confidence, and in her few years of driving experience, she'd never been in an accident. So Thompson settled down. Every time, receiving a salary, Stephen remembered a kind word. Baba Toma did not persuade her and great-grandson to get a profession. Where would he be now? Slowly he managed. In the village, where after the collapse of the kolkhoz everything came to a complete shambles, or would have broken the coven on loading wagons and occasional repairs in the city. Thank you. This he has already tried, and now he knows for sure that it is impossible to live on earnings from these coven even alone. And you can't even think about starting and keeping a family. Evelyn was right when she insisted on sending his little fool to study in the city. She could have persuaded her great-grandson to get a higher education. He'd be an engineer at the same oil company now, earning 3 times as much. Then he and Lisa would have had a child 2 years ago. Then they wouldn't have had to choose between a long, cheap course of recuperation after that unfortunate abortion and a quick but much more expensive one. But that's okay. The important thing is that they found a way out, even on the current budget. And doctors give optimistic prognosis. And about higher education, he will think when the first child is born. I mean, you can study by correspondence. Evelyn would definitely approve. Life got better. They stopped counting pennies, were able to afford better and more varied products, more modern medicines. They even started preparing for pregnancy. Stephen insisted that Lisa be seen by a competent and renowned reproductive gynecologist at a fee-for-service medical center. And it didn't matter that they had to sell the village house because Stephen's work schedule didn't allow to keep an eye on it. And the fact that how wistful and sad it was, and on business trips away from his beloved wife. From his family, also unimportant. These trifles can be taken out of the brackets, Stephen thought. After all, something has to be sacrificed to achieve a better life. There's no such thing as no sacrifice at all. Well, he sacrificed his childhood, his memory of the past, his peace of mind in order that his family would not need anything and grow children. And that sacrifice seems to be accepted. He finally seems to be doing well. And even the doctor said he could try to conceive on this vacation. His wife's body is fully prepared. In dreams of a future baby, Stephen went up to his floor, opened the door with his key and shouted from the threshold, "Lisa, Mommy Emily, I'm back." Thompson awoke around noon. He stretched happily in the soft, comfortable bed, breathed in the aroma of fresh-baked goods wafting under the room door. Emily had been witching in the kitchen since morning, eager to pamper her son-in-law. Stephen arrived and smiled. It seemed he had an adored cinnamon apple bun waiting for him. It was so good to be home at his place. After tidying himself up, the man poked his nose into the kitchen and realized he had guessed right. A handful of warm, oozing, mind-blowingly scented buns rose on a platter in the middle of the table. Stephen reached out his hand, about to kick one of them. Immediately, he received a playful towel across the palm of his hand from Emily. "Hold on, just a bit," said his mother-in-law with a smile. "Let them cool down a bit. Lisa will be here soon, and we'll have lunch." "Where is she?" asked the son-in-law resignedly, and poured himself some coffee. "She went to the doctor's office this morning," the mother-in-law explained. "She hasn't been since you left. I bought some vitamins. She's been exercising like he told her to. Now she'll have a checkup and find out if she can have a baby. Just in time for you to come back. That's good timing. Something's delayed. She was gone by 900 hours. I'm getting worried." Emily faltered, remembering Stephen, movies, fear of car accidents. But after a minute it became clear that the old woman was worried for a reason. The phone rang. Stephen picked up the receiver and heard a man's voice. "Thompson's apartment. Police Captain Christopher is also concerned about Thompson. Elizaveta Stepanovna. Who is your wife?" "You, Stephen, it must be." The voice slowed down and softened a bit. "Stephen, you need to come to the identification. Write down the address, 16 Komsomolskaya Street. Entrance from the courtyard." "Is there a police station there?" Stephen asked the stern voice. He knew the Komsomolskaya neighborhood quite well, but he couldn't remember the 16th house. Not quite. The voice hesitated a little, but continued. There's a forensic medical examination department and a morgue. Can you get there in an hour? I'll meet you at the entrance. Stephen carefully put the receiver on the lever and threw a quick glance at his mother-in-law. She was sluggishly at the stove and didn't seem to be listening to the conversation. Perhaps I won't bother her for the time being, the man decided. Forensic medicine isn't necessarily a morgue. Lisa may have had an accident or been attacked by someone, and now the damage needs to be removed. That's what forensics does. The word identification, uttered by the captain, Stephen diligently chased out of his mind. Emily, he said, trying to keep his voice as steady as possible. Lisa will be late. I need to go and help her. You promised not to wait without us. He finished and hurried into his room to get ready. Alas, Thompson's hopes were not realized. He was expected at the morgue to identify the body of his wife. I guess this is my curse. To lose loved ones in car accidents without a vital voice, said Stephen. All at home to a tired pathologist sitting in his office. First his parents crashed their car, now his wife. After all, as he felt that he should not buy her this 9. But I wanted what was best. Strictly speaking, objected the medic, raising his head from the form, which he filled out during the conversation. It was the other way around. First your wife's death, and then the accident. The autopsy showed that the cause of death was a blood clot, blockage in pulmonary artery. It happens. Blood vessels often clot, especially with sedentary behavior and high cholesterol. And then a slight increase in blood pressure is enough. As a result of strong excitement, for example, or just an awkward movement, and the clot breaks away from its attachment point, begins to move through the veins and arteries. It carries blood, you know, and it can go to the heart or the pulmonary artery, and then the person dies. That's what happened to your wife. She died from a blood clot. It caused the car to go out of control, which in turn caused the accident. Likewise, she could have died on the sidewalk, in a bakery, or even sitting on the couch at home, if the pressure spike had caught her in those places. So don't be so quick to blame yourself, young man. The pathologist put an ornate signature on the certificate, slapped a stamp on top of it, and nodded towards the door, inviting Stephen to follow him. The registrar stamped the rest, and Thompson received Lisa's death certificate. With this document, you will now go to the registry office, and they will issue you a death certificate. You have your spouse's passport with you. You'll need it there too. And already on the basis of the certificate, you will be able to prepare for the funeral. Place in the cemetery to buy, farewell table to order. But it's up to you. Oh, and take this list. It lists the things you'll need to bring to the morgue when you decide on the date of the funeral. Clothes, shoes, bedspreads, that sort of thing. Our orderlies will prepare the bodies. Give them whatever you collect. Stephen nodded. He obediently took the papers, mumbled a farewell, and walked toward the exit. Waiting for him outside was his buddy Christopher, one of the guys who worked with him on the crew. Christopher had recently buried his grandfather and had not yet had time to forget the whole ritual kitchen. He knew what and in what organization to formalize, what documents will be required, where to order a farewell and wake, how to communicate with the cemetery authorities. In short, he would have made a perfect funeral agent, but he undertook to help Stephen for free, simply out of friendship. When the latter, completely confused, called a colleague to ask for advice. In addition, Christopher had a car, and with him funeral troubles became not only clearer, but also faster. Let me see what you've been given. Christopher took the papers from Stephen's hands, looked through them quickly. Yeah, okay. Do you have your passport, Lisa? And your marriage license? But I'm good, so we're going to the registry office. We'll be there before lunch. Thompson sank into the front seat and began to consider what he'd learned from the pathologist. A clot. Okay. A blood clot probably could indeed have formed. Lisa does have a sedentary job. What about the blood pressure spike? I don't think she's ever complained about it. Christopher was tactfully silent. I didn't want to distract him from the road with my doubts. Stephen began to mindlessly study the certificate issued by the morgue, wandered his eyes over the bank, not particularly considering in the line heading surname, first name, patronymic, date, cause of death, and suddenly shuddered. Pregnancy was written in the Associated Pathologies column in the not neat but legible handwriting of a medical professional. Christopher Thompson almost jumped in his seat. "Christopher, turn around. We have to get back to the morgue." The gray-haired, tired pathologist was thankfully still in his office. "Yes, pregnancy," he confirmed, stunned at Stephen. "Absolutely correct. There can be no mistake. I've worked with your wife's body myself, and I remember the due date of 8-9 weeks perfectly. In fact, I can show you if you have any doubts, but I wouldn't want to embarrass you with the sight. I'm very sorry for your loss." But Stephen wasn't listening. 8-9 weeks is 2 months at the most. He'd been away for 3. "Oh, Lisa, what have you done?" She was probably told about the baby's future at her checkup at the medical center. So much for the excitement and the blood pressure spike that sent the clot on its gruesome journey. Damn it. Blinken Medical Center confirmed the hunch. After a visit from the gynecologist, Christopher finally took Thompson to the registry office. "Anyway, Stephen," he said, "you'll have to do the funeral. After all, you love this woman, so you must give her a proper burial. And will you or won't you deal with the rest of the circumstances later? It doesn't matter now. So pull yourself together, brother. We got things to do." Stephen Soka nodded and set off on his way through the instances. The man returned home only in the evening. He released the neighbor who was looking after his mother-in-law, gave Emily a list of things from the morgue. For a while, together with her, he picked up everything he needed from the leasing closet. Emily was tearful and a little lethargic from the sedative drugs with which her neighbor had stuffed her. But the deed, even if so mournful, distracted her and cheered her up considerably. Having finished with the preparations, she dragged her son-in-law into the kitchen to feed him dinner for company and skewered herself. All day a piece of food hadn't fit down her throat. "Stephen," she only sighed with tea. "She gave me tea, but I couldn't drink it." "You can't do that." "Emily," Stephen said sternly, "you and I are going to need our strength. Are you going to starve yourself?" After supper, Thompson brought the papers he had collected during the day and selected a photocopy of the morgue certificate. The original had been taken at the registry office, but he had managed to copy the report and a copy of Lisa's statement from the medical center. Emily had the same idea. Cautiously, he began. "I need to talk to you." The doctor said that Lisa was pregnant. He recounted everything he had learned today, showed his mother-in-law the documents. The elderly woman came, studied the certificates, sank her gaze and sighed. "Now, of course, it doesn't matter anymore," Thompson said in the meantime. "But still I want to know. I've been on watch for 3 months, and I'm 2 months pregnant. Tell me honestly, did Lisa have someone steady, or was it a random mistake? A one-time thing, so to speak?" From the way Emily's cheeks flushed, the way her gaze flickered, Stephen realized a one-off was out of the question. Lisa had a steady lover. However, the mother-in-law was in no hurry to tell about him. Stephen had to make a lot of effort to get his relative to talk. "The second year they meet in person," finally said Emily. They met at Lisa's gymnasium. He brought his little brother there to study. They have a large family. He is the oldest of the brothers. The younger one just started school. "You know, family is very important for a woman." Stephen raised an ironic eyebrow. "And Lisa and I said, 'Family is not important to her,'" he said. "But what kind of family is it?" My mother-in-law exclaimed sorrowfully, "You're always at work. You're always at work." And a woman, she needs her husband, was constantly around to feel support, to talk, to consult. Yes, want to go to the theater on the weekend, was with whom to go with. "Has your family been a hotel for a long time? So how can I be on the road all the time by my own will?" Stephen was indignant. "I earn money for this family for a normal life. For the same theaters, after all." "I understand, Stephen, the mother-in-law said softly. And Lisa understood that and was very grateful to you for it. She was just tired of being alone. That's why she couldn't resist when he started to show her some attention. He wooed her very nicely. You know, date bouquets, and an interesting conversationalist. He's got a college degree. And erudite, very understanding and tactful. You can literally talk to him about anything. Even about food prices, even about the classics of world painting Lisa talked about. She rests her body and soul with him. Stephen chuckled. And if only so. Emily stood up for her daughter. After all, they had a serious relationship. So why did she noodle around with me for so long? If it was serious. Thompson was indignant. It's not a household or serfdom nowadays. If she had told me everything, I wouldn't have kept it. Divorced and please, build your serious relationship with whoever you want. If I'm no good at lying, why? You see, Stephen. The mother-in-law apparently decided to be completely honest with him. Lisa really wanted a real big family. And Sergei, but that man, he was also set on a big family. And to have many children, he was used to living in a large family. He grew up with that attitude, you know. Well, there you go. And Lisa wasn't very good with kids, you know, after that abortion. So she thought it was only fair that she get pregnant and get treatment on your dime. And when she's fully healthy, she'll tell you everything and file for divorce after all. The problems with the pregnancy started after she had an abortion from you. So it's your fault, even if indirectly. Sergei has a decent income, don't you think? He could treat Lisa without a problem. But it wouldn't be right to make him fix your mistakes, wouldn't it? Stephen was so stunned by his mother-in-law's words that he felt no rage or even the slightest irritation. All emotions seemed to leave his body at once. All thoughts were gone from his head. His face turned into a lifeless mask. His voice was gone, and even his breathing stopped for a few moments. It seemed to him that he had been thrown with all his might into a hole of cold water, and now his whole body. My whole mind was focused on one thing. To surface, to take a breath of air, and go to the bottom. And so he, too, at that moment, was using all his strength to keep his sanity and calm in a world that had suddenly turned upside down for him. He could have said that he was not to blame for the abortion that Lisa had performed without even consulting him. But at his mother's instigation, he could have told her how much he wanted that child, how frightened he was for his wife when he saw her bleeding, how discouraged Stephen was when he found out the truth. He could have said that Lisa should have done nothing to start by voicing her grievances about frequent weaning to him and working together to find some sort of solution before falling into the arms of a random suitor. About how he himself loved his family, how he longed for them when he was away, how he wanted children, a big house, and how he stayed day and night to turn that dream into a reality. He saw no point in telling. It seemed to him that it had been understood as it was originally always. Well, it turned out it had only seemed so. It was his fault again. So if he had been there, Lisa wouldn't have gotten a lover, wouldn't have gotten pregnant by him, wouldn't have been scared of the pregnancy, wouldn't have had a blood pressure spike, wouldn't have had that unfortunate blood clot, and she would be alive. Failed again. Thompson failed again. So don't think about it. It's bullshit. It's not true. He's not the one who put his wife under the unknown Sergei. After all, it was Lisa's choice and only Lisa's. A lover and a lie. It is not and cannot be his fault. Emily eyed her son-in-law warily. As she began the story, she feared that Stephen would become scandalized, violent, perhaps even fight. That would be a natural reaction for a man of his level of culture, the older woman thought. She had always been a little condescending toward her son-in-law, believing that a country boy without higher education was incapable of any high feelings or subtle movements of the soul. But shouting with his fist on the table or on the wall would be quite normal for him in this situation, Emily thought. Even though Stephen had never once raised his voice in front of her, let alone made any kind of scandal. And now Thompson sat still and silent, and then leaned back in his chair, leaning the back of his head against the wall, and took a deep breath, obviously trying to calm himself down. Emily realized that there would be no scandal, and dared from this understanding. Dared to ask Stephen. Cautiously, she said, "Say, would you mind if Sergei comes to the funeral of Lisa?" What did not understand Sergei? Repeated mother-in-law. I called him, told him what had happened. He'd like to come to the funeral. Think about it. But they loved each other so much. It's not human not to let him say goodbye to Lisa. Emily, Thompson said slowly, looking into his mother-in-law's eyes. Do you realize what you're saying? What are you asking? I'm asking you to be honorable to your spouse and rival. The woman replied. If, of course, you know the concept of honor, Stephen thought. What kind of relatives I always have who want to play the game of nobility. One of them would kick his own daughter out of the house and call his grandson a gunman and scum. The second, hiding under the guise of nobility, asking me to spit on my own dignity. However, both of them are not relatives for a long time, and this is already a stranger. Except for the upcoming funeral, we have nothing else to do with her. The main thing is to endure the funeral. Stephen stood up, waved his hand, and went to his room, closing the door tightly behind him. But even this precaution did not help. Even on the bed, he could hear his mother-in-law talking into the phone. The funeral the day after tomorrow at 11 o'clock. Yes, Stephen didn't mind, and Thompson pulled the pillow over his head. But the voice continued to echo in his ears, thrashing around inside his skull, as if trying to shatter it from the inside out. The man tried to make it subside, but as soon as he pushed it himself, thoughts of Lisa, her lovers, her strange sense of justice rose in his mind. Her lies are straight. About an hour, Stephen got up, walked to the kitchen, took out a bottle of vodka from the refrigerator, poured a glass, and drank it in one gulp. He stood, thought for a moment, and repeated the operation again, not paying attention to the settled eyes of the mother-in-law sitting at the table. After that, he went back to the room, collapsed on the bed, and finally passed out. An unexpectedly large number of people had gathered for the funeral. Teachers from the gymnasium, students with whom she was friends, came to see Lisa off. Classmates, some friends, acquaintances, and neighbors. Stephen knew almost none of them. These were the things going through his head. There's your proof. You know nothing at all about your wife's life. If you'd been sitting at home with her, you'd know who's best friend, who's an acquaintance from the medical center, and who's a former classmate. You missed it all while you were driving. What did you think for the good of the family? Where's your family now? Yeah, it showed up. Stephen tried to push those thoughts away and focus on what was happening. But after a while, he realized that it would be better to immerse himself in reflection and indulge himself. And now, instead of heartily grieving for the woman he loved and with whom he lived not one happy year, he stares intently at the men present and agonizingly tries to guess who, which of them. Where is he, this Sergei? To look at his face, to understand, for whom the covenant changed. He began to watch the movements of his mother-in-law, who the girlfriends he knew were talking to, the reactions of those gathered to each other. There was no way a close friend could be so good at hiding her affair. Some of the women present surely knew about it, couldn't help but know. Perhaps their looks or words would give away a rival. And the degree. Why the hell would you want that? He tried to calm himself down, but after a couple minutes he noticed that he was busy looking again. He already wanted to approach Emily and ask her directly where the same Sergei was. The only thing that stopped the man was his unwillingness to humiliate himself in front of his mother-in-law. However, by the end of the procedures at the cemetery, Thompson was ready for that. And only after leaving the cemetery fence, he began to think a little. Let's rest and move. Christopher approached and clapped his buddy on the shoulder. Sympathetic. Or are you going to take the bus with everyone to the wake? Stephen inhaled and again fixed his eyes on the crowd of people going to their cars. Then he let the smoke out, shook his head as if to dispel his thoughts. I'm not going to the wake, he said resolutely. I'll go completely crazy there. Take me somewhere else, Christopher. No problem, responded his colleague. Where are you going? Home. Yes? Is that even a thing? I didn't realize it at first, Stephen. No, Christopher, I can't stand the bottom of it now. Where to? Who the hell knows? Some hotel, I guess. Take it tonight. Then I'll find a house where I can rent before the shift. What do you think, renting a place for such a short period of time? Listen, you don't need a hotel. After thinking, said Christopher, waste money and no peace at all. Let me take you to your grandfather's apartment. It still stands empty after him to inherit. The deadline hasn't come yet. Of course, we could rent it out without that. But you know, I don't have enough time to sort it all out, to put things in order, to put some things in, some to throw out. Let's do it that way. You live there and you'll help me with the sorting out of things as payment. It's good for me and it's good for you. I'll do it. Let's do it, Stephen nodded. He didn't really care about his mother-in-law. But the apartment will still have to be visited, things to pack. All the stuff in Thompson fit into 4 large plaid bags, 2 for clothes, 1 for tools, books, and other boyish necessities. And the last things he picked up before the sale from his parents' country home. There were albums with photos of his mother, a warm shawl, Evelyn's favorite cup, the chess game he and his father played in the evenings, something else that had no material value but held the memory of his childhood. The only seemingly happy period of Stephen's life. All those years of work, and not a damn thing to show for it. He grinned, looking at the bags. But it wasn't heavy to carry, Christopher said optimistically. He picked up 2 points out of 4 and hurried down the stairs. Stephen put the keys to the apartment on the kitchen table, picked up the 2 remaining bags, and carefully slammed the front door shut. He followed his buddy. After about half an hour, the foreign car slowed down in the quiet city center in front of a tall house of Stalinist construction. Whatever state Stephen was in, he could not help but marvel at the place of arrival. And after they entered the luxurious entrance with wide wrought iron staircases, went up to the right floor on an elevator with an open door, which Thompson had only seen in movies before, and entered the apartment, where the hallway was larger than his mother-in-law's kitchen. The man had it all sorted out, and curiosity passed. Examining himself, Christopher hospitably offered, putting a bulky bag on the floor, "I'll make some tea. There are no groceries here, of course, but tea and sugar should have remained. Or a quick trip to the store." But Stephen was already wandering around the apartment, and so he didn't hear his friend's question. He had never been in such places before, though he could assess the situation. The apartment seemed to have come off the screens. A movie about the life of the late 50s. High ceilings, massive wooden furniture, carved sideboard behind glass cabinets with books, from the shelves of which matte sheen, knotted gold inscriptions. Leather spines, a sofa with a carved wooden back and valances, a desk with bombshells, and tabletops behind a glass cloth. On the table, a papier and jasper press and writing instrument, a table lamp with green lampshades, portraits. On the walls, not photographs, but specifically oil portraits, red carpeting. Time seems to have stopped here and is not going to flow any further. It's sickening to catch up with the sum total. And the 90s. Good decision, by the way, Stephen thought. It's more peaceful that way. The front door slammed in the hallway. Bags rustled. Christopher still ran to the store, and a minute later had already hooked up the refrigerator in the kitchen, surprisingly modern enough, and loaded the food into it. "I knew you wouldn't even notice I was gone," he grinned. "But what do you think of the new place? Impressive." "You bet it is." Stephen confirmed it. "I've never seen anything like it in person, only in a movie or a museum." "Hey, what's it all about? Who was your grandfather?" Christopher shrugged his shoulders, poured water into a kettle, put it on the burners of the gas stove. "Grandfather?" he asked again. "My grandfather was a KGB man. Well, that is, first as a Chekist, then as a military intelligence officer, and then he had a good rank in the KGB. He was old. My grandfather is the same age as my grandfather. He didn't live to be 100, and he didn't leave the service until the last moment. Only just before the putsch he agreed to retire. He was bored sitting at home alone. His grandmother died early. She wasn't 60 yet. He loved her dearly. He didn't marry a second time, though there were those who wanted to, believe me. But he didn't. The department provided him with a housekeeper. He had someone to look after the apartment, but it was a forced measure, you know. But he wouldn't have tolerated any other woman but his grandmother. I spent almost all my childhood here, Christopher continued, picking up the table. My parents were always traveling, on expeditions. They were archaeologists. I had all kinds of ancient burials to dig up around the world. They died of some infection unknown to Soviet science. They brought it from Africa. No grandfather's connections, no doctors helped. Well, I was in my 20s then. I knew how to live on my own. And when I was little, I lived here all the time. I know every nook and cranny of the furniture. And now my wife says, let's renovate the ice apartment, throw out all the junk, buy new furniture, and move in. Of course, it's more spacious than our one room. And the neighborhood's upscale. Do you believe me? No, I can't. For her, it's a piece of junk. For me, it's half my life. I remember my grandfather working at this table, on this couch, reading me a book before bed, how I did my homework, about the secrets in the living room, how I learned to cook on this stove. And it's all these memories to throw away too. But you said you were going to take everything apart and turn it in, didn't you? Stephen asked, perplexed. I decided to put the kettle on the table solemnly, said Christopher. I will take apart two things, put aside what is valuable and memorable for me, and the rest is sold off to understanding people for furniture. Their paintings, these books have connoisseurs. So far I've recognized. And the furniture is good. And then you'll get a crew in here. Let them do the repairs and furnishings themselves, without me. And let her look for tenants and decide everything with them. Let this apartment become different, alien, faceless. But I won't see it, you understand. Because I won't be able to look at it. I understand, nodded Stephen, and began to tell his friend about his parents' house in the village, about how he tried to save it to the last. How reverent and respectful Evelyn had been of that wish, and how he still blamed himself for selling the house, as if he had betrayed his childhood, his family. Christopher understood and sympathized with him. Stephen spoke and felt that he was getting better, that the pain was going away and the tension of the last few days was subsiding. Despair and images from the funeral became paler, as if dissolved in front of vivid childhood memories. We ate dinner, drank tea, and switched to cognac. Hell, I'll drink with you, decisively said Christopher, arranging the shot glasses. I'll call a cab, if anything. And in the extreme, and here I will fall down, Poddy, do not kick out. He mockingly looked at his friend. Only if he promises not to sing loudly. Stephen answered in the same tone. I've hated snoring since I was a kid. Too bad. You wouldn't be surprised with my grandfather, grinned Christopher. He was wheezing. The walls shook. He was a good man, actually. I miss him. Although, you know, I think he died just in time. He probably wouldn't have liked the modern way of life as KGB, Stephen suggested. He didn't like it, confirmed his buddy. But that wasn't the point. It's just that Granddad had started to go a bit head over heels in recent years. Remember, at one time there was a wave of revelations of KGB and Cheka workers. They brought up some documents, supposedly deeply classified. They published memoirs of dissidents, repressed people, all sorts of horrors. They wrote about particularly brutal interrogations and atrocities of the staff. Do you remember? It still comes up sometimes. Thompson nodded. But Christopher agreed. Grandfather heard about it. Read a few articles, so worried, he kept saying that they would come for him and take revenge. Maybe he was worried for a reason. I'm sure it wasn't for nothing. You must have read what went on in those departments in the 1930s and 40s. I'm sure he had his share of sins. I calmed him down as best I could, but he was more and more afraid every day. My grandfather was afraid. I couldn't imagine such a thing in my life. And after a while, suddenly he got so angry and belligerent. He was still afraid, but he'd tell him to come. I'm no stranger to the world. I've prepared a surprise for them. Let's see who's going to send who to the other side. I tortured him. I tortured him about what he was talking about. But you didn't. What can I do against an old scout? He was getting worse every month. The apartment was a mess. A mess. He slept on the sofa in the study, often in his clothes. He never went into the bedroom, even kept the windows shut. He only left the house to get the newspapers. Tracked him. So if they wrote that about him with a newspaper in his hand, he died. I've looked through it all. There was nothing about the Cheka or the KGB in it at all. But that's what gave him a heart attack. Maybe he was just tired of being afraid. We had a drink. We were quiet. Then they went back to reminiscing about their childhood and the old men who had expressed them. It seems they hardly drank at all. But suddenly it was dark outside the window. It was nearing 0 o'clock on the clock, and Stephen was so groggy that he was ready to lie his head on the table and pass out. Christopher looked more awake. At least he had enough to call a cab, get them to his office and lay them on the couch with leather valanky, and even clean up his desk a little. How was he leaving? Stephen could no longer hear Thompson either. He woke up close to dawn, disgustingly sober and even without any signs of a hangover. Woke up wondering, where am I? What is this place? He raised his head, looked around perplexed. He woke up finally and suddenly remembered everything at once. My return from a business trip, a happy meeting with my wife, cinnamon buns with apples, the police captain's call, the cold morgue, the pathologist's office, a conversation with my mother-in-law, the funeral. The events of the last few days arose in his mind at the same time the boy almost suffocated at their arrival. For a while he sat on the couch, frantically gulping air with his mouth. Then he bent in half and vomited right onto the red carpet. But no sooner had he moved in, he'd already made a mess of the apartment. He thought grimly to himself, "You're always being unmanly. Thompson, everything's not human. Everything's a mess. You're always screwing up everything you don't pick yourself up for and failing to keep what you're given. You couldn't keep your parents because of you. They took a car ride into town. Did you ask for a special toy for a holiday gift that wasn't available at the local store? If you'd been a little more sure of what you wanted, wouldn't have had that trip and therefore the accident. You couldn't keep your grandmother. You stopped taking care of her. You left her alone in the village and she died. You failed to keep your firstborn child because you failed to instill confidence in your wife and did not provide her with everything she needed for a peaceful life. You didn't keep the house where you spent your childhood because I chased after the big bucks and didn't have the time to maintain it. Didn't keep your family together. Didn't give his wife the attention she deserved. And she found a lover. And he didn't save his wife. Gave in to her demands. Bought her that stupid car. After all, if the clot had broken off somewhere in a public place or at home, and she would have been ill, people nearby, perhaps, would have had time to call an ambulance, and Lisa would still be alive. And she might have gone to someone else, but she would still be alive. It's you. It's all your fault. Such thoughts were running through Stephen's head, and he couldn't cope with them. A young, healthy, handsome man with a good job and a normal income. He sat on the sofa in someone else's apartment and thought about the fact that his life seemed to be over. He had nothing left dear to his heart. Not a single loved one, not even a corner of his own. And he had only himself to blame. All his life he had done nothing but make mistake after mistake, even though all he wanted was to have a family and be happy in it. Was that too much to ask? If someone had been around at that moment, they would have explained to him that it was not his fault. The death of his parents was nothing more than a tragic accident. His grandmother's death would not have depended on his presence and constant care. Evelyn was already at a very advanced age. In addition, she felt that she had completed the main task in her life, raising her grandson. There was simply nothing else in the world for her. Marriage to Lisa, and it was doomed from the start. She did not put her husband in a penny, considered herself much higher than him, and agreed to his proposal only because she was panic-stricken of being alone. All her friends had already gotten married, and no one had asked her. It was a shame. Meanwhile, Mom was getting old, and one day she would be gone, and Lisa had no one else. So let there be someone. She never really loved her husband, nor did she respect him. That's why she didn't tell him about the first child. She had a lover and took fertility treatments at Stephen for money. To marry this lover, already being healthy and guaranteed to give birth to his children, and not to swap a chump for a chump. Thompson could explain all of this. I mean Christopher, or maybe Stephen would have thought of it himself. Just a few years later, after his emotions had subsided, his mind had become clear, and he had accumulated a little life experience and wisdom. And having realized all this, he would be able to finally calm down and meet a woman with similar goals and create, finally, the very family strong and loving, which he has always dreamed of. After all, such families only arise when a person has peace, clarity, and strength inside, rather than all-consuming guilt and fear. One more time to be wrong could be, but that was the only time Stephen didn't have. Giving in to hysterics, he rolled around on the sofa, pounded his fists on its back, sobbed, shouted something, pounded his head against the wall. What am I supposed to do now? What am I supposed to do now? Are you in favor of Pilon? Once again, I typed my forehead into the wallpaper above the couch. I missed a little, caught my head on the corner of the portrait frame hanging over the headboard. The portrait swayed from the impact and suddenly snapped off its mount and plummeted down flat onto the leather seat, then slid to the floor. So much for another destruction, Stephen thought habitually, and froze, looking closely at the wall. In the light twilight, a small opening was clearly visible in it. The niche was uncovered, no door. Thompson crawled closer on his knees and cautiously peered inside. With a trembling hand, he took out a heavy and brightly colored bundle from the catch he had discovered, laid it on his knees, unfolded it, and stood still, scrutinizing the find. The black old revolver was nodding against the oily quiver with a match sheen. What a surprise grandfather had in store for possible enemies. It flashed through the man's mind. That was why he slept in the study, so that the gun would always be at hand. Stop. If that's the case, it must be a working man. A quick inspection showed the revolver lubricated and loaded. Thompson put the barrel to the cushion lying on the sofa, cocked the trigger, and fired. For a while he looked at the bullet hole and the bullet itself, which had passed through the fluff and lodged in the couch. Great, he thought. That answers the question of what to do now. Stephen had always gotten at most a C in shooting in his elementary military training classes at school. But now, thank God, he didn't have to aim. Thompson made himself comfortable on the shot pillow, cocked the trigger, put the muzzle of the revolver in his mouth, and fired. After the deepening heat, uncharacteristic of May, flooding the streets of the town with a golden, soulful wave of fresh coolness, coming from the dark gray stone of the Catholic Church, the first of which, as legend had it, was laid by the same architect who had once built Notre Dame de Paris, Stephen was literally dizzy and lingered in the aisle, almost tripped, grasped the back of the pew with his hand, and took a deep breath. "Young man, are you feeling ill?" A certain old woman, Mrs. Justin, ducked out from behind him, looking empathetic and sympathetic. "No, thank you. I'm fine." Stephen forced a smile and stepped back, half a step to let the old lady pass. Mrs. Justine, thanking, levied the case forward, her head in a bonnet. Goose powder and silk ribbon roses bobbed, like a flag sailing a royal frigate. And at last it fell silent as Mrs. Justin sank into a pew in the front row, a seat she had been accustomed to occupy for more than half a century. Stephen settled down in one of the back rows, wrote, and was glad that no one was sitting next to him, because right now he was dying to be alone. But he had come to church because he couldn't do otherwise, because otherwise he just couldn't take it anymore. The priest, Father Stewart, appeared up front, and the sermon began. In general, Stephen could not call himself a deeply religious man. To be more precise, he had forgotten the last time he had been in such a place or turned to the Almighty. But today he was in dire need of consolation and absolution, because suddenly everything in his life, seemingly settled and more or less bearable, had gone wrong, and the nightmares of the past, the ones he had hoped had been buried long ago, had returned. They came again, and it would seem that he woke up, washed his face, brushed it off, and lived the whole day easily and happily. But the bad dreams, reminding him of all he had done, came tenaciously, and after them Stephen walked like a man out of his mind, and everything fell out of his hands, and in his head replayed those episodes of reality which he longed to forget. Stephen covered his eyes and, folding his hands, tried to listen to what the Holy Father was saying. Not just to listen, but to hear, letting the meaning of each word pass through him. And he was ready to beg anyone, and at any price, if only relief would come, if only they would help him. Stephen did not remember his childhood in Russia. His mother had taken his 3-year-old baby boy and, ignoring the exhortations of relatives, had followed her husband to Ireland. Stephen's father belonged to the Russian community, which seems to have been formed on the Emerald Isle in the 20s of the last century. And then one day, coming as a tourist to his distant ancestor's hometown, he met Adriana. Then he went to Dublin to work, and after a while she announced that she was pregnant. The man was in shock, but did not refuse the family circumstances and began, first, to send money regularly, and secondly, to prepare the papers for the move. And the first memory that was printed in little Stephen's mind was the call home. He cradled the cat so that it blushed the telephone receiver and clapped. "Grandma, I love you. But that's it. That's enough." Mother snatched the receiver from Stephen's hands and, throwing a few angry words into it, hung it up. Somewhere it was like being glued. Next to that memory was another. Stephen playing with a white teddy bear and a fire engine, and then leafing through a book of fairy tales with wonderful and three-dimensional pictures of Ivan the Tsarevich riding a gray wolf through dark forests. All these were gifts to her grandmother from Russia. She never forgot her daughter or her grandson. "I hate you," shouted Stephen in the face of his mother when she announced that she did not. They will not fly to the funeral of grandmother because there is no money. And right on the same day, by the way, Adriana lost all the monthly allowance she received as an unemployed person at the races, and with the second allowance, which was for the child, she bought booze. Bottles clattered on the table, mixed with cans with hidden iron edges and stubble. Canned goods, some of which already smelled bad. Male and husky memorized voices sounded in the room. Mother had visitors again. "We should teach him a lesson." One of the men ventured and tried to grab the 10-year-old by the scruff of the neck. But Stephen dodged and rushed away from the room and the apartment in general with a nose full of tears. And then, sitting on the steps of their brick house, showed himself heartily. He already understood well what death was, and understood even better that now the last and generally the only person dear to him had disappeared. As for his father, he had passed away 4 years after they had moved to Ireland. But Adriana clung to the possibility of living abroad tightly and completely dismissed the possibility of returning home. True, she did not have a good knowledge of the language of indecent profession, but it was possible to receive all sorts of benefits, and the Russian community helped a little. Earlier, the move helped Stephen to adapt rather quickly, learn the language and generally get into the environment. But at the same time, he also adored his native language and was often sad about the fact that fate had ordered his person in such a way. He often thought that if only his mother had not left, things would have been different. Maybe he wouldn't have slept. Would the family have held him back? By the time Stephen turned 16, his mother had gone completely downhill. The boy tried to spend a minimum of time at home, and the place where they lived. Now, it was hard to call home, because after the death of her husband, Adriana sold his small but decent apartment. And with the proceeds of the money, Rats lived in an apartment the size of a room that her mother had bought with the leftovers. And through the paint, you could see the wallpaper that the previous tenants had put up. It must have been in the 30s. "You've ruined my whole life," Stephen had said more than once. But his mother only grinned at him and threatened him with her finger. "Look, I was spinning. And I live abroad. My girlfriends must have been jealous of how they were in our province. I live abroad with my son." That's what my mother used to say. I entered the surrounding space with my hand with such a proud look, as if it was the palace of the Queen of England. At school, Stephen was one of the laggards. He also got mixed up with bad company. But in those years of his youth, these guys seemed cool to him. Outcasts of the common man's society, these obscure rebels. They hung around all day drawing on the walls, composing music or poetry. Stephen realized too late that the police knew his group by name for a reason. This group of honeyed youths from the suburbs were into petty theft. They also stole cars and acted as couriers to deliver things. "Brother, help me out." One night, when the streets are foggy, Stephen asked Jamie for help. The guy from this company can't get busy himself. His girls promised a date, you know. Hand it over. And Jamie handed his comrade a small package. "I can still pay," Jamie added with a pleading tone in his voice, seeing the man's hesitation. "Don't be so forward. There's plenty of money here. Where should I carry it?" Stephen asked. And Jane was terribly relieved. Instructed him. But something went wrong. That night, Stephen was apprehended by the police. I mean apprehended. After a heart-pounding, fox-like chase. But Stephen wasn't running from them. He didn't know exactly what he was running from, but he was very scared. As for the arrest, the thing was that a policeman identified Stephen as the man who had removed the car stereo the day before. The teenager was taken to the station, and there, by chance, on the same day, several other gang members were arrested, and those whom he considered his friends willingly told about everything Stephen had done with them. Because in this way, they could at least make amends for their own guilt, showing, so to speak, conscientiousness and willingness to cooperate. And from those conversations, Stephen learned that Jamie had died, hit by a car. Stephen thought it would be all right. He waited for his mother to come and bail him out. She was promised she'd be notified, but no one showed up. And the kid, before he even realized what was happening, he ended up behind bars, in a special facility for juvenile delinquents. And the days flew by. Stephen was shocked, terrified. But, as is typical of human nature, over time, he became accustomed to the circumstances, not just resigning himself to it, getting used to it. And when he was released the day after his 18th birthday, he was confused. What to do now? His mother visited him in prison only once, but not to encourage him, to comfort him. She was interested in one thing, whether Stephen had any stash of something left. And then she said he was an idiot because normal sons take care of their mothers. They're behind bars. She left, and after almost 2 years, Stephen had to go back to their apartment. There was nowhere else to go. So he did. His mother was found on the floor, fallen out of her wheelchair. During this time, she had managed to poison herself with logs, whiskey, broken legs, and was not treated. But despite everything she had been through, she continued to drink. "Sonny's back," Adriana whispered through what was left of her teeth and reached for the bottle. Actually, because she couldn't reach it. That's why she fell over. "Help," she called, looking at the bottle. Mother lifted his mother up, and he almost threw up. He'd met homeless people on the streets, of course. This was how they would live with a cold. The windows closed, the air alcoholic and stinky. There's a mountain of garbage on the floor, leftovers rotting on the table, furniture, appliances, everything that used to be of any value has been sold off. "What is this?" Stephen asked, taking a paper from the table. It was some kind of document, and his heart, a bad feeling. And that's the mother behind him gurgling to suck the leftovers out of the bottle. A bargain, she laughed. And I thought nobody wanted our villain. What are you talking about? Stephen frowned. This little apartment was certainly not the best real estate in Dublin. It was on the outskirts, in a house that needed renovation. But what Stephen heard next shocked him. It turned out that Adriana had sold some people their only home, sold it supposedly for cash. What had it gone for? Stephen knew exactly. And also for exchanging that apartment for some country house, a cottage in the suburbs. The kid exclaimed, "Mom, are you out of your mind? You can't get that much for our apartment." Well. He nervously leafed through the pages of the confusing contract. In general, Stephen was not a real estate expert, but he realized when he saw the numbers. His mother had sold the apartment for 1/10 of its real value. There was also the address of the new property that these realtors had bought for her. "It's time to move out," he mumbled, but his mother is in a hurry. "They say if I don't eat, the police will come." Stephen was breathing heavily, choking on anger, resentment. He realized his mother had been a victim of fraud, but there was probably nothing he could do about it. "Where are you going?" "Get some groceries. I'm starving." "Drunk," his mother shouted after him as Stephen jumped out of the apartment. The rest of the day the guy spent trying to understand the situation at the place specified in the contract, as the address of the office was a small office, where he was told that everything is normal. The deal is fair. And anyway, what claim does the young gentleman have if he had no rights to that housing? When Stephen went to the police, they listened to him carefully and said that they could not help because the deal was legal. "So you can, of course, go to a lawyer," the elderly officer advised. "But take into account the case risks dragging on for years. In addition, it will cost about several tens of 1,000 euros. By evening, it was drizzling rain. Stephen returned home. He realized it was the end, but he was also brutally determined. "Pack up," he told his mother. "I'll take you home." The thing was that on the way back, Stephen had time to find out what was at the address given in the contract. So he made a decision. He helped his mother gather the few things that were left in her pockets. It was empty, which meant there was no money for a cab. They took the bus first. Passengers interceded, fussed. Stephen could understand them. His mother didn't seem to have washed him for a long time. "Hey, let me help you," said a stout-looking man. "Looks like a laborer," and he helped him lower Adriana out of the bus. Stephen thanked him. They walked the rest of the way. Or rather, he walked to break the cauldron ahead. Here, the poor neighborhoods ended and the industrial zone began. And then they were at the city dump. The authorities had long promised to make the place look decent, but they had never gotten around to it. That's why there are a few barracks, built in the 40s for refugees from the continent. 2 of the 3 barracks were completely abandoned, with boarded-up windows and doors. One of them was still alive, where the homeless lived, and there, according to the contract, was Adriana's new accommodation, a room on the first floor with a broken window and a failed floor. There was nothing here, but technically the barracks was still listed on the documents as real estate. "Here we are," Stephen said. He allowed himself a wicked smile as Adriana began to realize how she'd been duped. "Son." The older woman's lips trembled. "How am I here? Don't leave me, son." She reached up to him, her hands all delicately veined, arthritis excluded fingers. "Did you choose this life for yourself?" Stephen's back was turned. "You're not my mother anymore, and I don't care if you die here. You drunk, you creep," he shouted, with a shower of tears, and then, turning around, threw himself away. He didn't care. He did it. Nearly 10 years have passed since that day. Stephen hadn't lived in Dublin for a long time. He had left it, having once bought a bus ticket to the west coast of the island with the money he earned. A lot has happened since then. Stephen worked on fishing boats, worked on a farm growing potatoes and cabbages. He's been a builder, a driver. Basically, he did the best he could. He didn't aspire to anything. He understood that a man, especially if he has nothing behind him, has no family support or financial base. For example, in the form of an inheritance. That such a person should try twice as hard to stand firmly on his feet and not let his life go down the drain. But the years flew by, and Stephen still lived as if today. And so fate brought him to this small resort town. Stephen was not a great fan of classical English and Irish literature, but it seemed to him that it was from such towns that Dickens, Austen, and others had written off the characters for their novels. Time seemed to stand still here, the abundance of greenery, the unhurried rhythm of life. Stephen worked on a construction site, or rather, was among the workers who built the house and had to perform finishing work. Although, in Stephen's opinion, taking into account the size and layout of the house, it turned out to be a whole mansion. Working here was interesting from a professional point of view, as well as profitable. Oh, that. And then clapped Stephen on the shoulder. Suddenly he jumped up, turned around and looked at another worker. "I didn't know you were a believer," Matt remarked. "I just came in for a moment." Stephen smiled guiltily. "I just wanted to, of course." He couldn't say that he had a guilty conscience and felt that he couldn't live another day without taking away his sins. More specifically, his major sin of the past. "I understand," Matt nodded. "Mine are sick. Corey, can you believe it? I thought they were vaccinated." The mayor complained about his family's difficulties. He and his wife had 5 kids. "Mary says it's our punishment for missing Sunday Mass. What can we do? We've got a vegetable garden to plant." "You're the one who's been complaining about Matt's life." "I was the one who talked him into it. I said, let's not go all the way to town. Let's just do things in the garden." So she agreed. Especially since my average Johnny, he stole watercolor paints and decided to paint his sister's dresses. Can you believe it? Matt choked on the bag, and Mary was washing, ironing, laying out for the girls so the dolls would show up for Mass. "So, anyway, I sinned and my Mary cursed," Matt sighs. "I got it too," says Johnny. "All over me." "So that's how we didn't go." "So why aren't you in your parish?" Stephen asked, just to be polite and keep the conversation going, because his thoughts were far away from the story of his acquaintance's life. "Well, is it not a good deed?" He came in. "Can I ask where you live?" He doesn't ask, Matt shrugged. "It's just that I'm in town all day today. I have to go to the drugstore, then to the supermarket, to the suburbs. I'll be back tonight. I already went to church. That means I did the right thing. Do you think it'll help my family?" Matt finished, pathetically. "It will," Stephen replied, thinking that it probably wouldn't help him. Or maybe it wouldn't help at all. Some auntie from the front pew spoke up for them and, turning around, flashed her eyes. "This isn't your priest. Are you here for the temple?" "I'm sorry." Matt was making an appearance. He was a master at it. "We won't do it again." Stephen breathed a sigh of relief. He, too, would like silence now. That's what he'd come here for. Silence. The priest's voice, his wisdom and prohibition. Stephen was determined to confess that sin today, and timidly hoped that maybe he wasn't a particularly religious man, but maybe he wouldn't be denied. Maybe all was not yet lost. Finally, the sermon began. The Holy Father started talking about how harmful it was to spend money carelessly and how it could ruin a person in general. Stephen sighed again with relief. He had feared it would be about something family-related, like how it was wrong to abandon his elderly, sick parents. Stephen had lost track of time. He felt like he'd been here forever. He even started to get annoyed that it was taking so long. He immediately gave himself an imaginary slap for such inappropriate thoughts. But at last the sermon was over, and Stephen began to make his way through the congregation. Everyone was saying a different word to the Holy Father. "Do I need to confess?" hotly blurted out Stephen. "The imp." "Hello." "Yes, of course." Stuart raised an eyebrow in surprise, but on the whole was not fazed by the assertion. "If you be so kind as to wait for one more person." "Okay." Stephen wiped his palms on his pants and sat down in the pew to wait. The church was almost empty. Stephen glanced nervously at the confessionals, wondering if it would be soon. and when the door opened, he jumped up and was about to enter. But a few moments were enough to recognize the man who had come out of the confessional, and for many years Stephen had not thought of him. His brain had discarded his image as unnecessary garbage for lack of use. Now, however, cold as a stormy sea, green eyes, short blonde hair so white it looked gray. But the man was not an old man. He was no more than 30 now. And then, on the night of the crippled man's arrest, barely 20 came out, cast around. A distracted glance passed Stephen, almost hitting him with his shoulder. Not in his eyes, not in his facial expression, not a shadow of recognition. Stephen, on the other hand, recognized it and knew for sure. There was no mistaking it was him. But how? Why? Now that night was printed in memory as an image on the first photographs of the 19th century with time faded, but you can see the important details. And yet it all seems so unreal. "Sir," the priest's concerned voice brought him out of his stupor. "Stephen shook you badly. You turned pale," added Stuart sympathetically. "Ah, no. Thank you. I'm fine," Stephen muttered. "You seem to want to confess," with a soft, friendly smile. The priest made an inviting gesture with his hand. I, Stephen, did not stop feeling like a great sinner in the blink of an eye. But just now any mood for what I had planned was fading away. "Excuse me, I'll come back later," he muttered, and hurried away from the church to Sun Street, to the air. He urgently needed to get out of the room and into the open. Stephen wandered down the quiet street, where every house was decorated from the front with boxes of flowers and climbing plants, and under the blind of the still sun he sank further and further into the events of that night. He just had to hand over the package. James had given the address and the exact location. He added that the man would come to pick up the package and pay what was due. In the meantime, he gave him an advance. And everything seemed simple. The only unusual thing was that for this Stephen had to turn to an expensive neighborhood of Dublin, where he had never been before. It all seemed an adventure to the young cripple. Jamie said that he was well paid for delivering the shipment, but since he was out of business himself, the money was due to the new courier. That afternoon, Stephen had just had another argument with his mother. She'd blown off what was due on the utility bill, and to relax a little and cheer up, because the matter was murky, he'd stopped at a bar on the way. Stephen saw no contradiction in that. He hated his mother, but he thought he was in control. The only way he could get rid of the alcohol, by the way, was to go to jail, where it wasn't, of course. And in the bar, Stephen ordered the most expensive and strongest drink. He told the bartender, "How old are you, son?" He frowned. "I'm not your son," Stephen muttered and slid a €50 bill. That's the way to go, including bribes. The barman took the money and poured. Then another and another. And when he got to the specified address, Stephen barely kept on his feet. He was confused and almost turned inside out when he realized that in front of him was a cemetery, or rather, the part of it that was melancholically desolate. The sun, meanwhile, had been completely replaced by the moon. The full, milky pale high fence was killed by ivy. And Stephen frowned. There must be a proper entrance here. What would he say, the caretaker? Nothing. It's not a museum. And they don't charge admission. I don't care. Stephen grinned to himself. Maybe he has a grandmother baroness buried here. But it was too lazy to look for the gate. But there was a hole in the fence. In one place, the bars must have fallen out from rust. Stephen was a teenager then, so it was easy to fit through the hole. He looked at his watch. It was still an hour before the appointed time. Well, that's just it, he decided. I'll wait. A cool breeze and a special atmosphere. All these crypts, the statues of angels who seemed to be watching him, all this would sober Stephen up. He was tense and confused, because it suddenly became so nauseating to wait there, in the agreed place, under a huge oak tree, and because there too stood the statue of an angel. He was dropping tears and reaching out his stone hands to someone. Stephen would not let go. The stupid thought that if he turned away for a moment, the statue might come to life, throw itself at him, because he wasn't a very nice person, was he? Vaughn noted another drinking buddy of his mother the other day and whistled after the girls in short skirts, and he disturbed the eternal peace of ladies and gentlemen. So Stephen wandered away, decided that he would walk a little way and come back. He had sobered up, and now he was gnawing with curiosity. What was he handing over for a few 1,000 euros? Certainly not a love note. His fingers took the roll out of his pocket and unwrapped it. Under the dirty cloth was a scrap of newspaper, in which was wrapped a wooden polyhedron covered with strange golden squiggles. It looked like a puzzle. A miniature box with a secret. Stephen began to twirl something in his fingers. What was it? His fiddling with the strange object was interrupted by a strange sound. In fact, it had been heard for about 5 minutes, but at first Stephen had thought it was a night bird. But now it must be because he had gone further into the cemetery. He realized it wasn't a bird or the wind. It was a voice. It sounded like a man reciting poetry, only it sounded animalistic. It was like a chaotic jumble of separate words, and yet Stephen could swear to it. There was a certain order to it. It was like a song or a spell of dark magic. I'm surprised at the nonsense that comes to mind. The courier began to hastily pack the wooden something back, but somehow he accidentally pressed on the wooden edges, and they opened with a quiet click, revealing a black gut, and in it shone a diamond. Stephen had never seen a real diamond in his life, but he guessed it at once. And although he had never suspected in himself such a craving for beauty, he found himself infected by the pure radiance, like the light of stars in the game of multicolored sparks. The stone was large, even by the standards of gems, huge, and it was scary to imagine how much it was worth. Stephen realized he was holding his breath only when his chest ached and his eyes darkened. The smell of bodies, bread and nervous air. And he started to close the secret box. There was no need to guess. Decent people don't pass gems with boys from the poorer parts of Dublin. So the stones are stolen. Stephen, of course, had been in many stories in his life, but he had never been involved in outright criminality. The strange noises subsided, and at the same time he realized he was no longer alone in the cemetery. He was just lucky he was standing behind another statue, not of an angel, but of a huge dog. Apparently, some rich aristocrat had decided to bury his favorite dog here with honors. Kostya sat down, because a figure separated from the nearest crypt under the creak of closing doors and floated along the path. He could not see the face or the body. Everything was hidden. A floor-length and dark cloak in a hand, draped in a dark glove, swayed an antique-looking oil lamp. Stephen crouched down, clutching at the cold stone in his gut that on no account should he be seen. And when he peered out cautiously, the figure was already melting into the distance. Stephen wiped his forehead, cold sweat coming out. He felt like a character in a Hollywood thriller. "What kind of day is yours?" the guy noted. "Ours." There were almost 40 minutes left till the meeting with the mysterious recipient of the cargo. "We have to wait." But Olga was now gnawing with curiosity. And what was that strange person doing in the crypt? There was definitely a mystery here, and Stephen wanted to solve it. That's why he went to the crypt. "I'll just take one look," the boy promised himself. The heavy door was ajar. Turning on the flashlight on his phone, Stephen dedicated the top. O'Neill read the letters embossed above the crypt entrance, and he realized it was the last name of the family members lying here. Thoughts popped into his head about how there must be a lot of germs in here. Stephen's first teacher, Miss Charlotte Lewis, hated two things: dirty and lack of discipline. The latter was dealt with by the use of a pointer, under which the offenders had to put their palms under. Stephen learned about the fact that children should not be beaten, by the way, only at the age of 13, when the school scandal broke out because of Mrs. Lewis. And for the first, this teacher had hundreds of stories in the style of that one boy ate unwashed apricots and died, and another stroked a stray dog and went blind. "It's a good thing you're not around." Ms. Lewis grinned. To encourage herself, Stephen and stepped into the crypt. Silence. Emptiness. Except for the burials. "Well, what else did you expect, you idiot?" He was about to leave when he realized there was another door in the back of the building. There must be mice or rats in there. Please let it be rats, Stephen pleaded to himself, because something was making noises. A couple of steps, peering in, devoted to the phones. Sarcophagus on a pedestal, white marble. The lid was made by a skilled craftsman. It depicts a sleeping warrior with sword in hand. Is anyone alive? Stephen asked. I wondered why his voice had dropped. Fear, I suppose. Oh, that's creepy. But he immediately breathed a sigh of relief. No one answered. So the strange sound must have been imagined. Boom. Luckily, it didn't hit inside the crypt, but outside. A sudden thunderstorm had begun. Stephen jumped up, dropped the phone, which bounced off the corner of the sarcophagus and fell behind it. It was brand new. I'd been saving up for it for 6 months. Where could I get a new one? However, if someone reminded himself Stephen did not behave like an idiot and quietly waited for the client, it was possible to buy a new smartphone with payment. Now it would be impossible to miss the customer at all. What time is it? Does not enter the crypt of poisonous vipers. Thoughts were racing, and not at once Stephen made out what was going on above him. Now there were sounds coming from the crypt itself and from the sarcophagus. It seemed as if someone was lurking there. The scraping was accompanied by a groaning that made the blood freeze in the veins. Earlier, when Stephen sometimes watched horror movies, he used to marvel at how stupidly their characters behaved. But he himself was no better. Instead of picking up the phone and running away, he spread out and stared at the sarcophagus. It appeared as if its lid had shifted. No, it had been lying ever so slightly crooked all along. On an impulse, Stephen began to move it to the side. Then he shone the light directly into the sarcophagus, and what he saw he could not forget. Actually, it was because of what he saw that Stephen went on a panic run, in which he dropped the diamond, dropped the box, and then, in shock, flew out into the streets of the suburbs and ran into a police patrol. He burst into tears like a little boy. And when the officer recognized him as a thief, he did not resist and only nodded in response to the words that you will go, boy, with us to the station. And there is safe. And from nerves, Stephen asked. The two patrolmen looked at each other. Yes, where else but there? The younger one answered. You all right? Are you feeling okay? No, answered Stephen. I don't know. Please save me. The teenager turned up his nose. The flashlight beam, faint but piercing, bright for this time of day, revealed a scene in which nightmare was strangely combined with Gothic aesthetics. True, Stephen hadn't thought about it at the time. His brain just absorbed what he saw and signaled it. We're in trouble. Let's run and see if it catches up with us. There was something lying among the sweet-scented snow-white lilies. Stephen at first thought it was a sculpture. He saw the tall features of a face made of marble, and part of the face was hidden. On the head of the one lying there was a helmet gilded, or perhaps gold. His attention, however, focused on something else. A few seconds passed, and it came to Stephen's attention. No, it was not a statue, but a man. Another wave of cold fake sweat. It trickled from between his shoulder blades. Had the bartender stirred in the last cocktail? Stephen pressed his palm to his stomach. The syrup was sweet. Cream, tomato juice. But the whiskey and the whiskey made a nasty mess too. Alcohol's evil. Consciousness prompted again. Maybe he'd passed out and was sleeping under a bush. Or maybe it is white fever begins. What are its symptoms? And then Stephen decided to check it out. That's a real person lying there. It's just the way he looked. I mean, it was like he was too perfect. Poor thing, Stephen thought. Must have died young. It's not the money that makes you happy, so it's better to be poor but alive. He reached for the body where the hands with gold rings were folded on the chest. The fingers clutched the hilt of an ancient sword. A strange sight for sure. It seems that in the olden days, warriors were placed in mounds with all sorts of bling. But it's fresh. Stephen took a noisy gulp of air, and his stomach seemed to settle down. The palm of the boy's hand went down to the chest of the one who lay in the sarcophagus. It was cold. Or was it the clothes? A strange leather jacket like the ones they wore in the olden days was freezing. It's a cold night. Wait, why is a modern man dressed like that? That's for sure. The rich have their quirks. Stephen, it's silly to giggle, because his buddies will be shocked when he tells them. It's not like drawing pictures on the wall of City Hall. Who's gonna believe him, though? I'll take one ring. What does he care? Stephen muttered and grabbed the man's hand. And the next moment, Stephen suddenly met his gaze with green eyes. His heart sank, his body stiffened as much as the one lying there. And then the one lying down smiled, contrite, and sat up abruptly. Stephen's wrist was in the grip of icy fingers. Green eyes turned, and from the mouth came the hiss, or rather the warning roar of a beast ready to attack. In the next instant, Stephen wailed from staggered. He lashed out and turned and flung himself away. Rather, the bushes whipped. Spit in the face. He twisted his leg. I don't care. Just to get away. It's spurring me on. Intoxication. Stephen just flew forward. He didn't stop, even though his lungs were burning with fire. Doing what? What's following his trail? He's from a sarcophagus that flies. Maybe he's already grown wings and will crash down from above. Stephen sobs, so he sped up. And then there was the street, the police patrol, and the arrest. Apparently, he looked really bad, because at the station, before locking him behind bars, in his cell, the policeman who had inquired about his well-being gave him coffee and fed him donuts. Stephen swallowed it all and went into withdrawal. He confessed to stealing the tape recorder, and then didn't really give much credit for other things. Hooliganism, insulting authority figures, shoplifting, usually chocolate bars and potato chips. But he flatly refused to talk about why he'd been scared and what he'd asked to be rescued from. But because he didn't want to be sent to a mental institution. And then he'd probably have to tell about the diamond too. And that Stephen was a freak. It's a real mess. How many years has it been since then? And then in broad daylight, miles away from Dublin, and in a church in a place like this, he met this man. Same eyes, same nose shape. 10 years on, but Stephen would have sworn it was him. It only created more confusion in his mind, though. No, as time went on, the guy stopped thinking he'd stumbled upon a real vampire or some other ghost. That's bullshit. There's no such thing. There's got to be a rational explanation for everything. And then, over the years, this episode went, as they say, to the farthest shelf in the vault of memory. But still, now the memory is refreshed, as if it happened yesterday. And I should be glad. It turns out there was definitely a man in the crypt, but something was bothering me. It was as if seeing him was an omen. Stephen didn't realize how he'd gotten home. It's called a footstep. Before everything went wrong, he'd thought he'd be able to relax a little on his legal day off. After he gets some help at church, that's how it works, right? After that, he wouldn't go to the pub for a drink. He's been out of that for a while. Ever since that day. But the pub was the best place to get the best. Chicken fried wings, perhaps. Stephen was going to have a bite of that. But now, of course, he didn't go. He lay on the bed, not developing. Stupidly did not care about the cleanliness of the house, was just lazy. But by evening and the stomach demanding sounded. And had to go to the kitchen, where he ate what piled up in the freezer instant macaroni and cheese for the microwave. And then already separated in wall in his outer clothes with pants to sleep. And what luck that there were no dreams tonight. What are you like? Matt asked the next day. You'd think you were dancing with the elves all night, not sleeping, wouldn't you? The friend grinned. Matt, like many locals, was quite serious about the little people, with whom, according to Irish mythology, both elves and creatures, medium between trolls and dwarves, were related. Or maybe Matt was playing with his eyebrows. You didn't get enough sleep, pretty girl. Stephen let the horseshoe pass not only in his ears, but also in the ears of the other bachelors at the firm. There was a perception that Matt had been pregnant again since finding personal marital bliss with the graying of his Mary's benches. We've been doing it ever since and trying to set others on the same path. It's just been that kind of day. Listen, let's get down to business, or we won't be able to do it until New Year's Eve, Stephen replied. But it must have sounded a little rude, because Matt chirped and, grabbing the creamery materials, moved to the other end of the room. The sun was hiding behind the clouds on the seaside today, and the wind was coming in gusts. All in all, the weather was just right for hard work. "Excuse me," a ringing maiden's voice brought Stephen out of his musings. In spite of the further heavy thinking, he was distracted by the yesterday's meeting, and even smiled involuntarily. "I ordered a pizza for lunch," Tessa said, fixing her red curls that had been knocked out of her neck by the wind. "And they told me they were having a promotion and two at the same time. So maybe you boys would like some pizza too. Pizza's a good thing." Murdoch's all fired up. Oldest guy on the team. A jack of all trades, he said he'd work for another year and retire to live on the beach with his wife, devoting himself to fishing. T. O'Neill, 26, single, not in a committed relationship, orphan, but has an older brother with whom they live together. She is an interior designer by profession and calls this house her best and most important project. Loves Italian cuisine, loves to dance. Dreams of having a street Bernard. Can't stand dirty jokes. All this information Stephen didn't collect, but it was dumped on him by Matt. And Stephen had a suspicion that someone was trying to take on the role of matchmaker. Except it was no use. No, in theory, he recognized that Tessa O'Neill was a very attractive girl. They say she has natural beauty and a striking liveliness of disposition. She had waist-length red hair and freckles to match. Now in spring on the face brightness, as if opened on the forest edge, the first flowers. Tall height and slender figure with feminine forms. TLC is most often seen in dresses, flying skirts. She is so romantic. It was also known that Tessa's parents left her and her brother a decent inheritance, but she is not Matt at resorts and parties, and learned and works hard. Also supports the local animal shelter for homeless animals. Good girl. Never thought about hopping in a cab though. What the hell? They belong to different worlds, don't they? He's a loser, a 30-year-old man without a corner of his own, and with such moral baggage that if he'd lived like this 300 years ago, he would have been banished from the city gates. In general, Stephen kept his distance. Even in his mind, almost always succeeded. However, that didn't stop him from admiring, of course. Ms. O'Neill in theory. The break with pizza had a beneficial effect, and after it the work boiled over with redoubled vigor. God willing, we'll be done by next weekend, Murdoch said, arching his back. Stephen nodded. The work was really coming to an end. It was time to wallpaper and install the outlets, and then they could turn in the project and get an estimate. And Mrs. O'Neill would no longer loom before his eyes. An unhappy thought came to his brain. Stephen mentally slapped himself on the back. You're thinking about the wrong thing. It's time to settle down. Somewhere he was tired of wandering around Ireland and living in the present day. Wanted stability, wanted to put down roots. Maybe it would keep him from the pain of the past. At last it was quite evening. The workers were leaving, but Stephen was still lingering. He stood on the veranda and the second floor of the house, from which he had an impressive view of the coast. Light-colored sand, tall grasses. The wind almost always blew here, and it must be fresh here, even on the hottest day. Stephen ran his palm over the smooth, dark wood. The top of the veranda fence was made of it, and the wall of the house on this side, where the spacious living room was. There were 3 of them in the house, and they were all glass. Suddenly, an image flashed in my mind of a weekend table for the whole family in this living room. A young woman like Tessa. Of course, one day she'll have beautiful children. And her husband. He's got to be a real man. He's got to be a real man. He's got to carry her around and never hurt her. He certainly shouldn't be like me. Stephen grinned bitterly, thinking that he himself had as much chance of having a normal family as of going to the moon. Because somehow, since his youth, life had gone wrong. And what good can come from that? Today's a good day, isn't it? TPP appeared on the veranda so suddenly that Stephen flinched. She stopped a step away from him, resting her hands on the railing. The wind flew in powerful gusts and ruffled her long new skirt. A snow-white tank top was tucked beneath a cashmere cardigan, and Stephen hastily averted his gaze from the seductive forms. Got himself a freak, thought he, angrily. A girl like that would never look at someone like you. Tessa started a conversation about what remained to be done in the house, and Stephen agreed that yes, it was probably not too late to make changes to the skirting boards. But of course, that would have to be reflected in the estimate and so on. But I think I'll go, he said, glancing at his watch, as if he had somewhere to go. But he just realized he had to go. Oh, I've totally lost you guys. Tessa laughed and deftly twisted her hair into a tangle. She intercepted the silk elastic band with pearls that had been dangling from her wrist as a bracelet. The wind picked up even more. And now even the seagulls flying over the coast were noticeably flapping in its gusts. No, it's all right. Stephen smiled embarrassedly. It's just that you probably have a lot of plans for the evening. We're all about business. Well, I'm not really doing anything tonight, Tessa shrugged. My brother will be busy with our shields, and I'll probably just watch a comedy movie, suggested Stephen. No, shook her head at Tessa, and the pearl earrings on the long chain swayed in time with her movement. Melodrama. I want something about love. I see, Stephen mumbled, and for some reason got busy with the coloring. Then he decided it was time to leave. He went down to the first floor, and already at the front door, he realized that something was missing. Of course. And the toolbox is an idiot. A brand new set that had cost him almost 400 euros. Could have cost less, but it was a good set, and with a lot of useful things for a builder of repairmen who wants to work in tone with modern technology. Could have picked it up tomorrow, of course. It wouldn't have gone anywhere overnight from the house. But Stephen had a thing for keeping all his stuff with him and in neat order. So he made his way to the room where they worked. Tessa seemed to be planning to set up a guest room here tonight. Stephen, if it were his house, would have used it for a home library or nursery, because the windows looked out onto the garden. On the first floor of the house, the lights were off everywhere except the hallway. But basically the night was cloudless, and the moon was full, so there was visibility. As Stephen entered the room, he bumped into someone. And it wasn't Tessa, and the moon was just across the window, so he could see who was in front of him, and it was the one with the wine eyes, and the type. Stephen froze. The guy froze, too, and the eyes in his face became like black holes. It seemed that he was about to grin his face and let out a trumpeting animal roar. But instead, the one who stood opposite only exhaled in astonishment. You are not Yura, answered the seated voice Stephen, and paid the price. On the plus side, the fact that he had met his past at all was a plus. Now it was clear that in front of him was a living person, which meant that he then did not catch a hallucination of a rebellious ancient knight. But the minus also outweighed it. This person also remembered everything, and was just furious and stepped on with a very bad look. I wonder, thought the heavies. Stephen, why is he angry? That you disturbed his peace. What the hell was going on in there? Where's the stone? A stranger from the past grabbed him by the scruff of the neck, pulling him closer. Where's my diamond? And the precious gem? Stephen, of course, remembered after the arrest, and more than once, but thought that since it was not possible to pass on, it would be better for him to keep quiet, so as not to get even more trouble. So it's yours. What is it? I don't know. I lost it. The green eyes didn't believe him. Where's the diamond? Tell me. Or what? Stephen felt an inappropriate sense of humor. I don't see a sword on you. The next moment he saw it thrown before his eyes by some dexterous trick at the door leading to the lower terrace. The blow knocked out his breath. In this part of the house, it was necessary to remove the finished floor at the last moment in order to get to the wrongly laid communications. What was the other firm doing anyway? And Stephen was unlucky. Collapsed right into the hole. But lucky too, because his back hit the smooth, not the pipes. He didn't move much. No, I don't think his spine's broken. You know, it's just luck. Green eyes, and who's clearly used to solving problems with his fists, also ended up in a hole. And he's hovering over Stephen again. We were wondering what idiot the courier handed the shipment to. Couldn't find it. And then the dumbass died. Jamie's mind was moving the gloomy little man. A guess, did you kill him? Green Eye's eyebrows crept upward in surprise. Why? No, he was an asshole, crossing the road where he shouldn't. He didn't have time to tell me exactly who he gave the stone to. But now I remember the face. There was no one else at the cemetery that night. So where is it? I don't know. Stephen's in my clutches and grip. I never thought of myself as a weakling, but there was nothing I could do against this type, and he suppressed not only physically, but as if he radiated energy of danger, cruelty. That's how the rival stretched out and suddenly smiled, as if he remembered something. He looked around at the whole construction pit. And you know, in the olden days, that the house stood centuries, and for good luck the foundation was taken. Zamulia sacrifice, when the rooster animal what? But human sacrifice is best. So maybe since you're so useless, you've forgotten everything, so unlucky. It's worth leaving you here, you psycho, whispered Stephen. And then suddenly he learned evil and charged upward with his knee. Gotcha. Green eyes lined up, and with a lingering sideways glance the enemy collapsed. Stephen, with the trot of a frog, climbed out of the hole. Purely masculine. He understood that mean blow. Really painful beyond belief. What's going on here? There was a worried voice. Tessa had turned on the light in the room and now looked out onto the veranda. Frowned when he saw the head of the man in the hole behind Stephen. Kirk, what are you doing there? We need to call the police. Stephen blurted out. That psycho snuck into the house and... That's my brother, exclaimed Tessa, and rushed to the hole from which Zeal, obviously still in pain, was climbing out. What the hell is going on here? Stephen stood in shock. This psychopath is Tessa's brother. In general, the girl told herself a lot about him, Tala, about how kind, wonderful he was, how after the death of her parents he took care of her, and for her sake he gave up his career as a detective, took over the family business. Both that man and this one couldn't be the same person. I'm fine, Kirk muttered. And the windpipe is all over the construction dust. Tessa, who is this guy, and how did he end up in our house? Him. The girl looked at them in turn. Stephen the builder, he works here. For a few minutes there was silence around the little company. The only sounds were the sound of the surf in the distance and the singing of a bird in the garden. Yes, Patrice nods flowers. The girl exhaled. The test had taken place. Stale and masking whiskey. How about we drink tea and talk quietly about everything? Judging by Kirk's face, to speak now he would prefer the last word over his opponent. But Stephen decided that to spite this man, who by his face and first impression would play villains in Hollywood action movies, he would keep peace for Tessa's sake. They went into the kitchen, and this room was the first to be finished and arranged as it should be. That was what the thoughtful Tessa had decided, and so now it was quite cozy. The girl piled tea, took out sandwiches and cakes from the refrigerator, put cookies on the table, and offered to have a snack. But her offer was ignored. Boys are boys, she grinned. Take a seat between her brother and Stephen, who looked at each other without even thinking, drawn to the drinks and food. So, what are you two fighting about? He stole our diamond, Kirk said flatly. No, he didn't. I dropped it or something, shrugged Stephen. Who stole it? What are you talking about? Asked Kirk. Is it fair to pass on jewelry like that with a guy from the suburbs? Like it's something criminal. Stephen made a logical argument. Or am I missing something? You don't have to understand. We should have just handed over our damn diamond. Kirk stepped forward. It seemed that in a moment he would jump up on the table and throw himself at his opponent. Maybe then we should have gone out after him, as we had agreed with the courier. Stephen raised an eyebrow expressively. Not lying in the crypt. What was that all about? What if I had a weak heart? What's this masquerade anyway? Where's the diamond? You expect me to believe anything you say. You know, when I first asked about it, I could tell you knew what I was talking about. So you stuck your nose in what you were asked to tell me. You think it's okay to be curious. And you expect me to believe that when you saw the jewelry, you didn't run away with it. I did. Kirk grinned. How convenient, and there's no proof. You, by the way, tried to take the ring off me in the crypt. I'd been drinking, and I felt awfully awkward. I was drunk. That's great. I think I'm starting to believe that a drunken idiot could actually lose what was entrusted to him. But how do you explain what? All right, stop. You're standing up, spreading your arms like a referee in a boxing ring. It seems we need to clear something up, and for that everyone needs to calm down. I am calm, Kirk muttered, but sat back down and even drank his tea defiantly. Petrus spoke up, addressing Stephen. After their parents died in a car accident, it was just the two of them. She was 15, he was 18. Her father owned a large firm involved in the production and sale of automobile fuel. Kirk had hastily taken over the board of directors, although it had previously been assumed that Tracy would be the one to move into the family business because her brother had chosen a different vocation. But Tessa was still too young, and Kirk decided to postpone the dream. Relatives, of course, existed, but theoretically, because the father of the brother and sister had long ago cut all ties with most of them. The head of the family, Mr. John O'Neill, was also a passionate collector of precious and semi-precious stones. His last acquisition was a diamond from India, a unique stone of pink hue, which had a rich history and was shrouded in legends. It was not easy to get it. There was a fierce battle at the auction, and not only in the bids. There were attempts to bribe its organizers as well. John O'Neill won, but on the way, when the stone was in Istanbul, it was stolen, and it turned out that it was done by an old friend of the men's private club, Mr. Albert Free. Of course, O'Neill's lawyers were ready to take up the case, but John feared that Albert had decided to cover his tracks and hide the diamond somewhere irretrievably. Then he came upon members of a gang in Dublin, among whom were first-class thieves. They took the order and executed it brilliantly. But John did not have time to return his treasure. He and Number Kirk, who knew the whole story, had to eventually take care of the precious piece of his father's collection. The stone was to be delivered by one of the gang members, and it was Jamie. Yeah, well, the guy decided to take the case. I see, said Stephen. Well, he thought it was a criminal case. Turns out it was. Well, it wasn't exactly legal either, but he could understand Kirk. Now there was one more detail. What the hell was Kirk doing in the crypt? I could say it's none of your business, Tissa's brother replied. It's our family's. Kirk, please. Tissa soothingly covered his hand with her fingers. I realize almost no one knew about this, but I think he can be trusted. Kirk reddened his face, threw from Papeliev an extremely suspicious glance at Stephen, but nodded silently and spoke. John O'Neill was not the kind of man who made himself. The family's wealth had been handed down from generation to generation, and almost all the ancestors in the family believed it was for a reason. According to legend, success and prosperity were granted to the first member of the family, Sturhepnu, about 500 years ago, when a brave warrior was lucky enough to capture and take Princess Mary as his wife. And since then, for each man of the O'Neill family, when the time came for him to inherit after the death of the head of the family, it was his turn to undergo a kind of initiation and test at the same time. The essence of it was that a man had to put on a gilded helmet and take a sword, and also put on rings. Both, as the legend said, belonged to the same tribe. The heir also had to put on a shroud and spend the night in the crypt. And not just any night. He had to spend it in an empty sarcophagus that was meant for him in the future. Yes, that was the tradition. When a boy was born, a sarcophagus was ordered for his future, the same size as a grown man. By the way, it was believed that it would deceive the evil forces, and in infancy, childhood, the hair would not dye. Kirk grimly explained an important detail of the sinister ritual. But it is necessary not just to lie down, but to sleep. That's why they also drink a decoction of herbs. Is it a sedative and a sedative? He grinned. You know, it's a very stressful environment. Stephen listened to this almost with a high jaw. So much for aristocratic family traditions. Creepy, isn't it? I must have had too little to drink. Kirk shrugged. I had nightmares, and I tried to wake up, but I couldn't. But then when you touched me, I woke up. Scared you. Scared myself, he answered for the first time, without malice, with a chuckle. I didn't realize who you were at first. I thought maybe Tomb Raiders. Who was that figure? I saw a man in a cloak come out of the crypt, Stephen said. That's why I thought I'd come in. It was me, Tessa sighed. You were a bit of a shock, Stephen, for a 15-year-old girl to be involved in something like that. What was I supposed to do? I shrugged. We had to honor tradition, but you were alone. I'm sorry, but who would blame you if you didn't do it? No one. Tessa agreed, but we couldn't insult Father's memory. She looked fondly at Kirk. I couldn't leave my brother alone. I had to be there in case anything went wrong. Of course you did. Stephen was confused. So since he was supposed to be asleep, that's what Diamond was supposed to take him? Yes, she nodded. I was going to wait in the car, then pick up Diamond and wait for him to wake up again. But then I heard my brother's voice, and I didn't see you running away. Kirk woke up. He wasn't feeling well. We came home, called the family doctor. It seems we didn't prepare the potion correctly. Stephen thought that personally he would not have been forced by any family honor. The memory of his ancestors to sleep in a tomb and drink a potion of unknown herbs according to the recipes of ancient witches. More tea, perhaps? Tessa suggested, and without waiting for an answer, jumped up from the table behind. I was in the kitchen. So you're saying you lost the diamond? Kirk's voice combined skepticism. I would if I believed in oaths, Stephen replied. I really needed the money then, and I really thought I'd make money on the delivery. I sympathize. Kirk grinned. You were left without a diamond and without money. I know it was a lot for someone like you. Janie must have passed the task on to someone just like you. Kirk indignantly clattered the dishes with the kettle. Kirk, Brian Neil Ono, behave himself. Kirk obeyed his sister enough to even throw a Stephen. I'm sorry, but you're partly right. The man grinned mirthfully. I needed that money badly. I thought I could get my mother into a rehab center, he added. Stephen had told almost no one about his past in recent years. It was just generalities, because what was there to tell? It's embarrassing. And that's if we don't talk about his last act, about betraying his own mother and leaving her to her fate. Suddenly Stephen spoke. Words poured out of him in a free flow. But he didn't speak in order to get sympathy. He just needed to share it all. His childhood, his youth, how his mother had left him, and how it had ended. He also told that about 6 months after he left his mother, he began to doubt the rightness of his action and decided that no, you can't leave her like that, even though drinking was, in fact, her choice. Stephen decided to go back, but when he arrived, it turned out that his mother had been moved to the hospital because her health had gotten quite bad. Hospitalized right out of the barracks. One of the homeless people sympathized and called an ambulance. Stephen rushed there and was allowed to enter the room. Since Adriana had no insurance, the hospital naturally provided the bare minimum of services. Doctors said that they managed to save the body, but the mind. In general, drunkenness and life shocks. All this led to the fact that Adriana began to go crazy, and the doctors said that according to the rules should be discharged, and further is not their business. Unfortunately, where will the patient go? Stephen was lucky to get a job on a fishing boat. Prospects were excellent, but that's if he lived alone, forgetting his mother. Now things had changed dramatically. With great difficulty, he managed to find a boarding house for the elderly, where Adriana with her diagnosis was accepted. And it cost a lot. Plus, there was a down payment for several months in advance. Stephen asked the owner of a fishing boat for help, and he agreed to lend the necessary amount. In return, however, Stephen had to work almost without a salary for about a year. He agreed. He paid for his mother, and then, when he started traveling around the country, he continued to do so. It was hard, but he kept going. The only thing he didn't have the strength for was to visit her. He had never seen her once in all those years. He still couldn't forgive her for ruining his new life through hers. She had ruined it for him too. And he was also afraid of her just reproaches. Though the doctors at that boarding house had said that Adriana had little grasp of reality. But lately the thing was that recently he had been contacted by the boarding house and told that his mother's condition was rapidly deteriorating. The doctors said to prepare for the worst. And Stephen sort of looked at himself from the outside. What kind of man is he? Is it even after so many years, and now that his mother has become quite old and helpless, he cannot let go of offenses, even if just. He could not find the strength to come closer to her, to brighten her last time with his presence, as a good son should do. Conscience was cutting, gnawing. When else would it make itself known through the years? A dull ache in once broken bones. Except Stephen couldn't cross that threshold. He couldn't not only not forgive, but agree that his mother was important in his life, not existing on its margins as an unfortunate duty, which he had to fulfill only for moral reasons. And when Stephen's story was over, when he had poured out his soul in front of these two, in fact, strangers, who had only once appeared in his life as participants in the unfortunate episode, he suddenly felt better. It was as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Kirk sat with his arms folded across his chest, looking past Stephen to the sea outside the window. Tessa shouldered his thin fingers and looked directly at Stephen as if she intended to peer into the deepest corners of his soul. "What happened to you can't be compared to anything," Tessa said quietly. "Every person's experience is unique. But she hesitated, because she obviously hurried to unite her feelings with her brother, whose opinion about the story Stephen did not yet know. "I can understand," she continued. "How does it feel to lose everything? We lost the family business, the competitors. They came in and took everything away. We went out of business and pretty much lost everything. We had to sell the family home. We couldn't keep it anymore. It turned out my father had a business loan, and the insurance was written in such a way that the insurance company refused to pay anything. We sold almost everything," Kirk added. "There's a little left, but it's crumbs compared to what it used to be. All the proceeds went into building this house. First they made the foundation. Then Tessa went to school to make it just the way she wanted it. Tessa had always wanted to live by the sea. What so many generations of our family had treasured was taken from us. But perhaps," he grinned thoughtfully, "it's for the best in a way. At least now I have a chance to do what I wanted to do. Otherwise I'd have been sitting in the big boss's office all my life." I think Tissot kicked him under the desk with his foot, because Kirk jerked and walked in, quietly sending his sister an angry look. Well, sometimes, of course, the saying goes that it wouldn't have been lucky if misfortune had helped, Stephen said. "Only the price for change is high, isn't it? And as for me, well, I don't think my life can basically go back to normal. It just doesn't seem to be by fate." Stephen's a little miffed by that comparison. Come to think of it, they had lost everything, but had enough money to still build such a house by the sea in a resort town on the background of the fact that he was actually on the street. It certainly hurt. Plus the thought slipped in that if he hadn't gone to the crypt then, you would have taken the stone. He would have gotten the money, returned quietly by a different route, and not been captured by the police. He wouldn't have gone to jail. He could have put his mother in rehab. And the curse. His whole life could have gone right. Maybe if things hadn't gone so wrong back then. But it wasn't really Kirk's fault. It was Stephen himself who screwed it up. "All right, I'll go now." Stephen rose from the table. "Thanks for the tea." He smiled at Taxi. The girl got up to the sink with the dishes. Kirk rose to follow, clearly intending to walk her to the front door. "I've been meaning to ask you something," Stephen said, already on the doorstep with repairs. "Anyway, do you mind if I keep doing things around here?" "Why not?" Kirk shrugged. "As long as you're doing your professional duties, you're welcome to come." The words were said politely and to the point, but as if with an undertone. Stephen inwardly tensed that Kirk noticed the glances he was throwing at his sister. So they were just glances. It's clear as day that Stacy can be absolutely nothing. The next day was quite ordinary. The house was bustling with work, though she didn't show up at all. She usually stopped by every other day to see how the construction and finishing projects were going. This day everything was falling apart, but Stephen held his ground and didn't even swear when one of the workers, a young boy who was still a green trainee, accidentally dropped it on his foot. Returning home in the evening, Stephen habitually pressed the button on the phone to listen to the answering machine message. Usually there was nothing there, but now he heard an unfamiliar voice. He never hung his jacket on the coat rack. Stephen listened to him. The guy who introduced himself as Jeffrey said that they needed to meet urgently and talk. "The matter is urgent. It concerns the boarding house where Stephen's mother lies. I'll be expecting you at the Gull tomorrow from 10 o'clock to 12 o'clock. Believe me, it's urgent." Stephen could not even guess who it was or what it wanted. But it seems that the mysterious Jeffrey did not belong to the staff of the boarding house. Work on the house involving Stephen's team. The next day were scheduled from 9 o'clock, so it was literally possible to get an hour off. The Seagull establishment was opened back in the 30s of the last century and served as a true gem of a marina, from which almost all 4 seasons opened pleasure boats running along the coast. Stepping inside, Stephen noticed it at once. A young fellow sitting at the farthest table, near which stands a lemon tree in a tub. On his head cap pretends to read a newspaper. "Good afternoon." Stephen sits down on the seat opposite Jeffrey. "Yes?" he asked, and after a nod continued. "I recognized him right away. It's just that those who are wearing caps now are walking around, and you are like hiding from someone. So what is it? What did you want?" The waitress came over, and they both ordered a cup of coffee, so as not to sit empty-handed. Jeffrey was visibly nervous, but at the same time he gave the impression of an educated and serious young man. It turned out that a year ago his family decided to put his grandfather in the boarding house. Unfortunately, the old man was diagnosed with dementia, and he also constantly dreamed that he was being hunted by some secret agents. At first it turned out that everything was normal, and when Harry visited, he smiled, saying that everything was great, and the boarding house seemed just a resort. But then something alerted Jeffrey to this. Something was that Harry suddenly changed his delusional fantasies. Now he was saying that he and the other boarding house residents were being abused. And only on visiting days they changed him into clean clothes and told him not to complain to his relatives. And it was very strange, because the psychiatrist who had previously seen Harry said that his disease of the mind is characterized by a fixation on what has absolutely nothing to do with the surrounding reality. Grandfather said there was proof of that. Jeffrey continued with a sigh. He said that if you went to the first floor, you could go down to the basement, where they had made a punishment cell for the naughty ones. I decided to check it out. And when I left, I pretended I'd forgotten something in Grandpa's room and walked on unnoticed. I found the stairs to the basement. The door was unlocked, and there was a light on downstairs. There was indeed a room and a door with a window. I looked in and saw 2 orderlies tying up an old lady. It wasn't the kind of room where, you know, they can lock up a violent patient for a while. It was just a hole with a cement floor walls. It was cold, damp. This poor woman was sitting on the floor in her nightgown. Her hands were shackled, seen shackled in museums. Could it be the same thing? I managed to make a short video. I managed to get up and pretend it never happened. I went to my lawyer, and he believed me. I was lucky. He said another man had approached him with the same complaints. his relative had given up a lot. His health got worse in that boarding house, and the lawyer said it was serious. The owner of the boarding house is a powerful, respected member of the community. The police would need a good reason, apart from the complaints of the old people and the videotape, which they would check if it was taken from a horror movie or a fake. And so I decided to contact other people whose relatives are in that boarding house and see if they noticed anything strange in the behavior or condition of their relatives. Maybe if we teamed up, we could make it work. Stephen listened to Jeffrey without interrupting, and he believed him from the first word, because his gut told him the guy wasn't lying. But there was something else that was dark, something that was bothering me. "This woman you saw," Stephen asked in a hushed voice. "What did she look like?" "Seemed very petite," Jeffrey said. "Gray hair, cut short. It was dark in there, but I'd better show you." He hurriedly pulled out a smartphone and handed it to Stephen. "That's my mother," Stephen said, barely seeing the video. But it took his breath away. "I haven't seen her in a very long time. I've only been told she's doing well. That's my mother. I'm going to get her." He raised his voice so high and jumped up so sharply, almost knocking over a table, that other visitors to the Gull encroached on them. "It's not that simple." Jeffrey shook his head. "Did you read the contract to discharge the patient? His condition is mental and physical. A special committee must first determine. This is to protect the boarding house from possible claims. Suddenly, one of the old people will become ill due to the negligence of relatives when they have already taken the guest, and so there will be evidence that the deterioration is not the boarding house's fault. So it'll take about a week. Are you already taking the grandfather?" Stephen asked. "Yes," Jeffrey nodded. "I've applied. I don't care." Stephen exhaled. "I'm not going to wait for her to be bullied any longer. I'm going right now." Only it was much easier to say than to do. The bus to get to the village, near which the boarding house was located, left only late at night, and there was no money for a cab because Stephen had not been spending his budget very carefully lately. The advance wasn't due until the day after tomorrow. On top of that, the phone was ringing off the hook. The foreman demanded that Stephen report to the site immediately or he would be fired. I had to comply. And besides, Stephen decided he'd try to get some cab fare from Matt or Murdoch, for instance. But when he got to the house, neither was there. The first had taken time off work because a child had fallen down the slide and had been taken to hospital with a suspected fracture. And the second went to scandalize the supplier of coffee tiles for the fact that, despite 100 clarifications, sent the wrong shade. So we'll have to wait. "Everything okay?" asked Kirk, who was in the house that day to sign a couple of papers to accept the delivery of the next final stage of work. Yes," nodded Stephen. Yesterday's state of mind, when he was pouring his soul out, was far behind him. But it wasn't completely silent either. "You're not wearing a face," Kirk snorted. "Is it something with your mother?" "Yes," Stephen blurted out. "I have to leave immediately." And he outlined the current situation in a few sentences. "You're talking. The lawyer's name is Archibald Stone. I know the guy. He and I go sailing sometimes. We've known each other since high school," Kirk said. "He said he's working on a case right now involving some big shot. I sympathize with you, but how are you going to pull this off? Do you want to just barge in and take her? Why not?" Stephen's fists were itching, as they say, and his thoughts were racing frantically. I'm afraid those words were not easy to say, but they had to be said. "I'm afraid I won't make it, Mom, if anything happens to her. I'm sorry. I must be distracting myself from the really important things," Stephen said with a bitter chuckle, because Kirk was suddenly distracted by his cell phone, apparently texting someone. "So I guess this is what we'll do," he muttered. "We leave in half an hour." "What?" Stephen rounded up, eyes at a loss. "Are you going with me?" "I think Dennis alone. Can you manage?" He smiled at Sill's eyes. "And I brought someone with me. So I think there's going to be a problem." "Yeah, that's probably it," sighed Stephen. "Not us, them." Kirk patted him on the shoulder. And it came out so unexpectedly reassuring and friendly, almost brotherly, that Stephen's heart warmed. Stephen had thought the foreman would grumble, perhaps threaten to quit. But when Kirk had said a word or two, he let him go easily. I told him that I was paying for the construction, so I had the right to take you away for a while if I really needed to, on personal business. And I said that if he didn't have time to do something because of that, I wouldn't make any claims, and I'd pay for an extra day for the crew to finish everything. Cleared Zelina's situation. The eye cut out onto the suburban highway. The car was driving at the maximum allowable speed, and taking into account that the highway was busy, Stephen was forced to admit, great driver, almost all the way past in silence, and when they arrived, at the gate of the boarding house territory, they were met by another car, from which came out some very formidable-looking shaven-headed type in a black leather jacket. "Who is it?" Stephen asked bluntly, because he didn't quite know what was going on. "An acquaintance," carelessly clarified Kirk, clearly not wanting to go into detail. "Let's say, although the firm is gone, but there are still some old connections." He was silent for a while, and while they were waiting for the guard to come out of the gate, he continued, "In general, if we tried hard, we could keep the firm 10% to success. Theoretically there was, but Tessa wasn't ready to shoulder the load. And it's not that I chickened out, but my father always said if you're not sure about something, you shouldn't do it. We saved what we could. And I think we're on the right track now." The guard who came out said glumly that today was not a day for visiting guests, which means they need one. "We need to see the director of the whole place, about his skinny-headed type. Look, you're not a security guard." I was about to object, but the skinheads did. Leaned over to him, whispered something in his ear, and the guard's face stretched. His face turned pale. "Why didn't you say so in the first place?" Almost. He shouted in a frightened voice and opened the gate, clearing the way. "What did he say to him?" Stephen inquired. "He hinted that if we weren't allowed in, Mr. Jonathan Green would be very unhappy. That say, many people believe that he has something to do with our Irish mafia and that his name is on the rumor. And that it's true." Stephen was not at all smiling at having anything to do with the mafia. "That's not exactly what people say," Kirk grinned. "But Jonathan Gray was once my father's golf club partner." He nodded at the leather-jacketed man. "His stepson Peter, who we shared a sandbox with. Nice to meet you." "A pleasure," Peter asked menacingly without looking at Stephen. "But if you have such acquaintances, why didn't you defend your father's inheritance?" Stephen still could not see the logic in the actions of his brother and sister. "I've already explained," Kirk answered sighingly but patiently. "Father himself would have done the same thing if one day he could no longer manage the business properly. We would have brought the firm down and ruined all the reputation our family had built up. This way we kept the family honor and a few percent of the stock." The cars stopped in the parking lot of the boarding house, and now there was no time to talk. Stephen could barely keep from breaking into a run. The guard, glancing at the small company, subserviently escorted them to the director's office, and now Stephen realistically barely restrained himself from just punching her with his fist, or preferably two. On the cold round face of the director with the connivance, or maybe with the instructions of which defenseless old people were treated so disgustingly. Unlike the guard, the headmaster was not so accommodating, and even the mention of the powerful Mr. Gray did not seem to affect him at first. However, he was still nervous, twirling the pen in his fingers. His eyes were racing. "I swear, no one has ever complained about our establishment before." Finally, in desperation, he declared, "We treat all old people as our own kin. And besides, pardon me, but the headmaster gave Kirk a hard look. Do we have any of your relatives, sir?" "No, fortunately not," Kirk grinned wickedly. "I wouldn't trust you with an old rat, sir. And as for complaints, personally, since I have had no dealings with you, I will make no complaint." But when his palms hit the countertops, he jerked forward, nearly smashing his forehead into Nolito. The nervous beauty of the headmaster's face. "But it would be sad if I witnessed my friend being denied his legal right to take his own mother." Wouldn't it? There's more to it than just the rules in your contract, right? And legally, you have no right to keep her. Isn't that right? I see you're well aware of that. The director's tone was more accommodating and almost visionary. Of course, I have now arranged for the mother of this esteemed Mr. Stephen to be helped to pack. Don't bother, snorted Kirk. You will escort him to her now. The headmaster reached again to loosen the knot of his tie with half a finger and nodded. One more thing, Stephen added boldly, and following Kirkorov's example, moved toward the director. Do you have another old man? Stephen's heart was aloud in this okay, which stopped. He walked down the corridor and pondered what to say to her. First of all, to apologize, to promise that he would not leave her again. But now they were in front of the ward. A nurse in a strict gray dress, who looked terribly displeased and but had to obey, opened the lock of the door, and it fell away. Adriana sat on the narrow bed and looked out the window, or rather, at the window, because it was closed with the blinds down. How had she aged? Stephen thought. Is it really her, mother? Quietly, he called out. Adriana slowly turned her head. At first he thought it was too late, but the expression on her face had changed. And the main thing was not even the smile on her pale lips, but the way her eyes lit up in a flash. Stephen on the verge of hearing. She dropped the word son. I'm awake. No, Mom. Stephen, unashamed of the tears in his eyes, stepped toward her. A moment later, he knelt down in front of the bed. He plunged into the warm embrace of his mother's arms, just as he had done long ago, when he was a child. Mom, I'm back. I brought you back. Kirk and Peter froze on the doorstep, and then tactfully stepped out behind him and covered the door, so as not to interfere with the intimacy of two people finally dooming each other. However, it was still almost 2 o'clock before they could all leave the boarding house. The reason for the delay was Harry, who at first got scared, thinking that he had done something wrong and would be taken to the SAU for it. Then he said that secret agents from London were waiting to capture him and bring him to the Tower to be tried by the Virgin Queen. The old man was so stubborn that Stephen finally decided on a highly atypical act. He said he had personally witnessed Harry's grandson deal coolly with a couple of such agents, and then took a written promise from them that they would leave Harry alone. And the scroll was secured with the Queen's ring. On a wave of creative imagination, finished Stephen. True raised bones and eyebrows that resembled Harry's snow-white caterpillars. And what was depicted on the seal? May I ask, Lilia? Assumed Stephen, belatedly remembering that it was a symbol of sorts from the French monarchy. Aha! Harry grinned and clapped his hands together. I knew Louis had something to do with this. Well, in that case, I'm calm. So what are we standing here for? Come on, let's go. And then, when they were already down on the porch, Harry turned toward the boarding house, picked up a pebble from the ground, and swung it at his neck, sent it flying all the way to the window of the headmaster's office. Cool, sincerely admired Stephen. Let's go quickly, he hurried everyone. But how did you do it? Geoffrey, whom Stephen had telephoned to say that Harry would be waiting for him at the Gull, was shocked when he heard what had happened. I'm not. Stephen shrugged his shoulders. Was that it? Him, he nodded at Kirk, who was clearly uncomfortable with being grabbed. And now he rolled his eyes and muttered that please stop talking about it, since the case was already done. I was at the lawyer's office, Geoffrey told me excitedly. He said the paperwork was finally ready. The last time I talked to him was a week ago, and he really seems to know how to work. So we're going home now. What about the family? Stephen asked. Won't they want to send Harry to the orphanage again? Or will you look for a good place this time? I actually thought it would be best for him, sighed Geoffrey. I think I'll take a vacation from work for a while. I'm a photographer for a magazine, and basically they can do without me for a bit. There's someone to replace me. I think I can look after Grandpa for a while, and then I'll think about it. But I certainly don't trust him to anyone else. The hero of the discussion was sitting there, and the varnish was chocolate for the money. The whole company occupied a large table, so there was enough room for everyone. Adriana just sat and looked through the window at the sea, over which seagulls were flying. It had been a long day. Stephen himself had to make up his mind. After all, he lived in a tiny apartment and could not imagine how he would be able to combine work and taking care of his mother, who still had a little bit, but had problems with consciousness. But once again, Kirk surprised him by saying that it was possible to hire a good nurse for Stephen's mother, or even better to work in shifts. And for comfortable living, of course, it would be better to move into a 2-room apartment. And then, of course, Adriana should be examined as soon as possible and as fully as possible to determine the necessary treatment for her. Unfortunately, Kirk noted there was a strong possibility that she would still need constant medication and medical supervision. Thanks for the advice, Stephen sighed. But I don't think I can afford all that. I'll keep it simple, brief, and even a little strict, Kirk said. No objections, he added. An emotion of shock and amazement came over Stephen's face. I can help with that, Jeffrey said. You got my grandfather out of there. I owe you a debt of gratitude. Stephen was confused. What do you mean, essentially strangers? Yeah, they were both very wealthy, but it's still an offer of help. I don't know what to say. He expressed his feelings honestly. I just did. Thank you. I will. There's no need to say anything, Kirk said. Better just do it, and do it soon. He added, nodding at Harry, who was flirtatiously informing a passing young waitress that he could show her around the world because he had secret agents as friends. The next few days, or rather weeks, passed in incredible bustle. They seemed to stretch on like an eternity, and yet they flew by so quickly. Stephen's mother and he were settled in an apartment downtown, with attentive professional caregivers to help manage everything. Kirk helped Stephen negotiate an emergency vacation at work. Jeffrey kept him in the loop. The director of the boarding house and his assistants had finally been charged appropriately, and all the elderly wards had finally been taken care of. The renovation of the house, by the way, was finally completed, and one day Tessa said that she wanted to meet Stephen, that they needed to talk. At first it was about how nice the house was, and how glad Tessa was that Stephen was doing so well with his mother. And then somehow Stephen asked Tessa out on a date. She froze, frozen, with only her long pearl earrings swaying. And here I thought you'd never go for it. Suddenly she laughed. And I'll have to do it all myself. You mean ask you out on dates? That wouldn't be so romantic. He was amazed that she'd been looking at him for a long time. And now he could breathe a sigh of relief that the date had gone well. And then, yes, Stephen still mentally returned to his doubts that he was not a match for Odessa, and even thought with trepidation about how soon the relationship would undoubtedly have to be severed. We should talk, Kirk said. Stephen was at his and Tessa's house at the time. She had recommended him as a good repairman to several of her friends and had called him over to discuss details of future work and to give him a couple of tips on future clients. These friends, as Stephen realized, were very rich people, and he thus had the opportunity to build up a large client base so that he could leave the firm and work as a private master. Or maybe you could start your own company one day, Tessa told him. And it was clear she wasn't kidding. Good, agreed Stephen with a pick. The men stood on the veranda, the sun slanting over the horizon. Seagulls flew over the water. I didn't tell you this, Kirk said with a sigh. But my sister hopes you'll propose to her soon. Yeah, Stephen gasped with excitement. He had thought about it, but it seemed like an unrealistic dream. I've thought about it, he admitted. Good, Kirk nodded. Because I'm not going to let anyone play with my namesake. I don't know what she sees in you, but I respect her choice. Kirk's hand came down on Stephen's shoulder. The fingers squeezed made her happy. I believe in you. I'm giving you a chance. But remember, if you see my sister, I'll send you to the other world with my own hands. Stephen smiled. He had no doubt that he loved his namesake and that he would do anything to make her happy.